Well, let's get going on. Who wants to give the 1-minute summary of the book? What the hell is going on here?
Yeah, I can try this. I guess this is my specialty, probably. So this text has, rebuffed me a dozen times trying to summarize. I guess this is my specialty, probably. So this text has, rebuffed me a dozen times trying to summarize it. But I think, in short, what Wittgenstein is doing in the first part that we read is he's building ever more complex pictures of language and dismissing them. He starts with words attached to things, but think of all the kinds of things there are. Okay, so words attached to things in different ways, but think of all the different ways that they could attach. So that's not clear enough. And he just dismisses bigger and bigger pictures of language until he gets to the point where he says, and so there is no single essence of language, single view that encompasses all of language. It's not that simple. And then in the second section, so the private language argument, it's weird because I don't think private language was a big topic until he brought it up. I don't think it was a thing, but he's saying something like language is a public cultural thing that develops among people who agree to play a game a particular way, and you can't make up your own language. That's not how it works. Words get meaning among cultures of speakers and not because some individual decides this word is going to mean this thing, and that's it for me.
The concern with private language, it's not like people were arguing for there being private languages. It seems like a pretty silly thing to even think about, but he thought that it follows from this traditional account of meaning, which is something that he himself had ascribed to in his earlier book, The Tractatus, or at least something like that, which founds meaning on ostension, right? Which is pointing out something and saying a word. That's that thing. Right. Oh, okay. Well, once you point to enough things, then you've got a language. And so it would seem then that there are personal experiences that we have that can't you then point to that? So if you get hurt and you feel a pain, can't you kind of to yourself point to that pain and say pain? And in fact, what you mean by pain, since it refers to that private thing of yours, maybe that's different than what I mean by pain and what somebody else means by pain. Because if language is built on ostension, ultimately, then you run into these problems about knowing what other people are talking about. At least in outline, I don't know that I have a problem with there being that problem. That's part of the despair of art.
Yeah.
Is that we're all separated. We're all cold and alone and separated from each other by this existential void. Why wouldn't we think that some of our experience and the things that we talk about should reflect that?
Well, but is that what Wittgenstein is? He's not claiming that there aren't subjective experience. He's claiming there's no such thing as subjective language.
Correct.
I think that's an important distinction, that you can have your own pain, but articulating it in terms of language.
He seems to talk at some points as if the idea of having one's own pain is nonsensical.
He doesn't seem to go as far as saying that there's no such thing as private sensation. He'd make the distinction between private language as a game that has rules, and all he means by game is that there are rules that are being followed. So there are expectations involved.
Is unique a better word than private with respect to sensation? So he's not saying your pain has to be public, but he's saying something like...
Yeah, I think unique helps.
Your pain isn't special. There's nothing about your pain that only you can access or that sets it apart from all other pain. Pain is pain. And even though you're the only one who feels pain at this moment, it's you're not the only one who feels pain or feels it in the way you feel it.
Would he really deny that the sensation itself is unique and that there's a distinction between communicating what that sensation is to others as opposed to, let's just take something like seeing. It seems like he wouldn't deny that the photons that reflect off the wall and enter my eye are somehow unique to me in the sense of being a particular event.
Right.
What makes them articulable in language is the way that then gets extrapolated. And he would deny that I would have a unique private language to describe those sensations.
But he seems also to be saying that sensations can't be thought of as unique individuals that can be named. Have we explained really what his argument against private language is?
No, and it would be good to maybe present it in the context of, unless you just think it is isolatable, I saw a progression
Should
here.
we start from the beginning?
Yeah, because we'll get to language games then.
Should we back up and then come back to
Yes.
private language?
I don't think we can do that without Seth telling us to.
Can we please get back to the text? I think we should slow down. Back to the beginning. There's a few basic ideas we need to get on the table before we can jump to that. How's that go? Is that better?
Thank you.
So, when a mom and a dad love each other very much, how far back are we going?
Yes, let's start there.
Okay.
Before we start, do you want me to preserve your anonymity to take your entire vocal track and put it through one of those witness protection adapter so you kind of sound like this?
You have to make him sound like Daffy Duck.
That would be terrible. That would be hilarious. I probably not. I can't imagine the complaints you'd get as a result of that. I actually had the experience not long ago, maybe 3 months ago. Someone who doesn't know that I write Philosophy Bro recommended Philosophy Bro to me, and that was like a big moment. Yes, that felt great. I was like, oh, is he funny? I don't know.
Nice.
It's like somebody telling Peter Parker how great Spider-Man is.
Right, exactly.
Well, I think you would have to then write your own blog in counter to Philosophy Bro.
Right. Who is this asshole who thinks he knows about philosophy? And just run up the drama between us.
No, I think what you'd have to constantly be taking yourself to task for not being serious. How can you be so flippant and use such foul language about such important things? I'm sure you get plenty of comments like that.
You know, I get fewer than I thought I would get. Someone who does Heidegger expressed that my Heidegger post was sort of nonsense and there's no real value in what I do. But that was like one negative opinion, and I've heard from a lot more people who really enjoy what I do, even at the super tenure position. Even the endowed chairs, I've heard from a couple people who have those. They're like, this is super good. So that feels really good. I've also learned a lot about rhetoric and the language. And if you go back to some of the earlier posts, they are a lot dirtier is probably the term. And not even in terms of how much I swear, but the particular swearing that I'm doing, because there's kind of a sexist vein in bro culture. And even though I'm mocking that, it feels weird. And some people have taken me to task for using words like bitch. And it turns out I don't really need those words to make it funny. So I've learned a lot about how that's received.
Oh, bro, you got to keep it real, man. You got to keep it real.
I can do that, though, without being sexist. I can still be an asshole. I can just be equally an asshole to everyone, which feels good.
Well, I know on our site, Wes has been known to post as an alternate, particularly grumpy user repeatedly and criticize his own posts.
That's right. I'm Burrow. I'm coming out. I'm really Burrow.
He poses as a piercing fan. Oh, man.
All right, so the beginning of the investigations, we have referred to, it's not just this basing meaning on ostension, but also the notion that goes back to Plato of what a definition is supposed to be, of what, right? If you understand a specific word, well, you understand the name, right? It's just the name for a thing. That's the ostension. But if you understand a concept is identifiable on this old Wittgenstein and Russell syntax as a set of objects, right? So if I understand what blue is, that means that I could, not that I can name all the blue objects right now, but I could identify for any given thing whether it's going to fall into that category or not. So the way that was interpreted historically is that you need for any given concept a set of necessary and sufficient conditions to understand it, right? Mm-hmm. All the things that meet these conditions will fall into the category. And if it doesn't have these other conditions, it definitely won't fall into the category. And if you've specified that, that's the definition. And so we have Plato having Socrates say, hey, stop just naming examples of justice or whatever. I want you to give me the meat of the matter. Give me the actual definition. And this was made very explicit in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions in Aristotle. Is that right? That he actually used that terminology, or am I imposing that?
Necessary and sufficient?
Yes.
That sounds right, but I can't say for sure.
That is at least the made-up thing that I will assume that from my long-ago memory.
This is an account of meaning, though, right? That's common to Plato and Russell and early Wittgenstein.
Yes.
Although early Wittgenstein is a little more radical about it. And that's the idea that ultimately meaning comes from naming, from reference. Mm-hmm. So to kind of summarize the early Wittgenstein, the Tractatus, you could take any proposition and ultimately decompose it into these ultimate atomic propositions where you have basically just proper names. So they're predicating something. So you will have a basic name standing for an individual or referring to an individual, and then a concept term or a general term which refers to a universal. And that's the account of meaning which Wittgenstein is now going to reject here. And then ultimately with the Tractatus, with the picture theory, you get this sort of, it's not like a proposition as a whole refers to a fact or a state of affairs in the world, but it does have a reference-like relationship, and that's this picturing relationship where it's this isomorphism or structural similarity between the proposition and the relations between its elements, the names. So that structure is similar to the relationship between what's named, and that's how you get a theory of meaning for propositions as a whole.
Yeah, folks who found that confusing should just go back and listen to our 2 Tractatus episodes that we did long ago. However, maybe there is something in our interpretation there or a relevant summarial fact that you want to throw in, Bro, or Dylan, who is not with us.
It's really interesting that Wittgenstein is coming from as radical a reference view as you can get. And there are points in the text where he so sometimes he refers to it like, oh yeah, my earlier work, the Tractatus, that was stupid. But other times he refers to himself in the third person, like, that asshole who wrote the Tractatus, that guy had no idea what he was talking about.
Well, and usually when he's objecting a view, he just says something and he puts it in quotes.
Right.
But isn't a language just a picture of the facts? And then he goes out of quotes. No, you asshole.
What a ridiculous idea, guy. Who is me? Yeah, that sounds right. I don't know where I read this. It might be an apocryphal story. It might be a super well-known story. That one of the earliest things that sort of shook Wittgenstein out of that positivist slumber was G.E. Moore gave him a really, really obscene gesture. I was like, what's the logical form of this? And I gave him the finger or something equivalent. And Wittgenstein stormed out of the room angry because he didn't know. And then realized oh, that still communicated meaning to me. He was clearly telling me to fuck off, even though that doesn't refer the way you'd think. How strange. And then that set him on the path to, since we all know what that gesture means. Had you heard that before?
I hadn't heard that. That's great.
No, although I was terrified that you would bring up G.E. Moore. I don't know what that would set Mark off
let's
on.
Just make sure we don't discuss G.E. Moore in any detail. Ever again.
Yeah, no, that's completely forgotten. Are we not G.E. Moore fans? My bad.
It's fine. Somebody recommended that we read one of his essays on common sense, which I opened before this but did not look in any detail about. Maybe there's more specific things we can get into that he's reacting to besides his own picture theory.
One more thing to say is that the place of rules in the Tractatus, right? The only rules you're dealing with are the rules of the logical calculus, where you get the ways in which the truths of certain complex propositions are related to the truths of their parts. So, of course, that's where if someone gives you the finger, the rules at work there, which are semantically important, are not simply logic. Right. And that's really the problem.
As brilliant as it is, there's a way in which I feel like it's just sort of a dumbass idea in the first place. I don't really understand how the Tractatus and that idea of one-to-one correspondence, atomistic language, survived at all. I don't even get it. This is after we already knew that there were multiple versions of geometry that didn't correspond to one another. This is right around the time of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, even with respect to arithmetic. And the notion that now all of a sudden there's aspect in the world, even with the weaknesses in philosophical investigations, the notion that it's a reaction to the Tractatus feels like he wrote a straw man in the first place in order to react against it. I know that's not what happened, right? And maybe somebody can try to convince me how utterly brilliant it is, even if it's misguided. But my reaction to it is, this is immediately completely crazy. It misses absolutely prima facie notions about the world that are right in front of you, staring you in the face.
To be fair, it's not supposed to be an account of the way language actually is now. So you would not have to account for the obscene gesture, etc. It's supposed to, that if you're actually trying to get at what the informational content of language is, and that's how really you figure out what is being said and what can legitimately be said, right? So a lot of philosophy he's going to dismiss as nonsense because it really can't be put in this logically precise form.
Yeah, so ethics means nothing, right? And that kind of thing. Yeah, that's fine.
Right.
That's fine.
Yeah, and it fueled the drive in Carnap and these other guys to try to create a logically correct, symbolic language that would be superior to our ordinary roughshod, silly way, which is exactly the thing that he's now in investigations Wittgenstein is completely turned around from. And if there's any sort of big influence from the investigation, it's to, I don't know if he started or maybe he just was concurrent with a trend toward ordinary language analysis.
Yeah, I don't think the Tractatus, though, is as weak as it looks on first blush, because it's dealing with some very specific problems, I think, in a way that is kind of genius. I mean, the whole picture theory, some of the problems that we discussed with Frege, trying to figure out how to think about the relationship between these sentences, let's say, and the world. It's a very difficult problem to even begin thinking about, right? It's sort of crazy in and of itself to try and think about the way language relates to the world. So the idea of that isomorphism, the idea of these internal relations that can be in both language and the world is kind of neat when you get down to it.
I don't mean to indict it as being, I guess what I find surprising is the notion that you would be surprised that the Tractatus is a mere beginning. He surely was aware that Euclidean geometry had ceased to be the only possible geometry. And in fact, there are a huge multitude of geometries.
How is geometry relevant?
Right, you're going to have to sketch that out.
Yeah, I think more than one geometry is fine.
Yeah.
I guess I'm maybe picking geometry as opposed to arithmetic or something.
In other words, that there's supposed to be a unique set of true propositions that basically describe the world. And that's what the picture theory should entail. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on the Tractatus or anything like that, and I haven't spent hours sweating over that book. My reaction is more to this presentation that Wittgenstein was utterly convinced of the Tractatus, and then he made a turn and has now the philosophical investigations in which it dawned on him that there was aspect in the world. And while granting the utility and in fact, the difficulty of doing the exercise in the Tractatus, it seems to me that it would be a plain beginning. Now, this might be a partly historical issue that, we're in the grip of logical positivism and so forth and so on. And I find logical positivism prima facie just crazy that you would say that that is the beginning and the end. I find nothing about it convincing. And that might be part of my problem.
I think that's probably the right way to look at it. I think that the Tractatus is probably the best and a really remarkable expression of a view that we now know is so wrong. Ever since Quine turned the verifiability criterion back on itself, they're how do you know that only things you can verify are true? Can you verify that? And everyone's oh, right, okay, internally incoherent, got it. But when logical positivism was big, Wittgenstein was the best at it. And that's probably why that work is so revered. I don't think anyone takes the Tractatus seriously now as probably true. It's more look at how well developed this view was before we realized it was wrong. This was really good. They worked really hard to make this work, but couldn't.
Dylan, I would say this too. I mean, my kind of aesthetic experience with Wittgenstein is love and hate. He's a tremendously frustrating person to read in both his early and his later forms. And one thing I can say is I do remember that I think all of us, when we did the discussion of the Tractatus, got quite a bit out of the text, even if ultimately it's not the answer to whatever question was being posed. It was tremendously thoughtful and sort of thought-provoking. If it hadn't been, if we'd spent all that time on it and it just was nonsensical or whatever, then I would have been really frustrated. And there are times with Wittgenstein that I feel that way. I'm just either this guy's saying something immensely profound or he's the most naive idiot who ever got, treated with such praise and honor. That's kind of the tension I feel in what he's saying. And I feel partially because he's been canonized that there must be something more when I hit that point where I'm really? Is this you're just stumbling upon what every child knows? There must be something more to it. And I have a tendency to give him more leeway than I think I would other people. But there's always that tension present.
It's what Socrates took himself to be doing too, sort of unlearning all of his mistakes.
Well, one of the things that is refreshing about Wittgenstein is the way in which he's engaging in those childlike questions and trying to sort it out from the beginning. And I really do like that. He very rarely refers to anybody else, which I like about it.
And yet the book starts off with a nice, juicy quote from Augustine.
That's true.
By the way, I was talking about this podcast, what we were going to do with my girlfriend, who has no formal philosophical training. And when I asked her to describe how she learned the words for things and how she learned, she literally, almost like word for word, gave Augustine's account.
I'll read it since you're referring to it.
Okay.
I'm not going to read. I'll just read the Latin.
Yeah, please read it just in Latin.
The listeners will. No.
I assume the listener can translate for himself.
When they, my elders, named some object and accordingly moved toward something, I saw this, and I grasped that the thing was called by the sound they uttered when they meant to point it out. Their intention was shewn by their bodily movements, as it were the natural language of all peoples, the expression of the face, the play of the eyes, the movement of other parts of the body, and the tone of voice, which expresses our state of mind in seeking, having, rejecting, or avoiding something. Thus, as I heard words repeatedly used in their proper places in various sentences, I gradually learnt to understand what objects they signified, and after I had trained my mouth to form these signs, I used them to express my own desires. So what could be wrong with that?
Maybe we could say, what is the revision of that Wittgenstein gives?
I think what he says is something like, if we want to say that names attached to things, the variety of things that there is means that attach means something completely different for verbs and numbers and apples. To say that the word red attaches itself to a color is something completely different from saying the word apple attaches itself to that thing. So we have to rethink what kinds of words there are and what those words do. We can't just say yep, they hook right in.
Even if you kept all the words that Augustine says, it's not that, a kind of Adam out in the world naming the things of the world, and every child is a child of Adam. Rather, the thing that the child is learning are the rules for that correspondence, and not the names.
Rules in the sense of the ways in which the words can be used, sure. Right? So if I taught someone what a slab was, and if I could do that in the ostensive way, or say, here it is, and the idea there is that the meaning of the word is just this, whether it's an image or something like an image of a slab that I bring up before my mind, that wouldn't really tell me everything I knew about how to use that word. So you can look at the first language game he creates, which is simple.
Shall I read it?
Sure, but let me finish the sentence. It's just rules in the sense of the ways in which the words can be used, sure. Right? So if I taught someone what a slab was, and if I could do that in the ostensive way, or say, here it is, and the idea there is that the meaning of the word is just this, whether it's an image or something like an image of a slab that I bring up before my mind, that wouldn't really tell me everything I knew about how to use that word. So you can look at the first language game he creates, which is simple. Sure,
this is from section 2. Let us imagine a language for which the description given by Augustine is right. The language is meant to serve for communication between a builder A and an assistant B. A is building with building stones. There are blocks, pillars, slabs, and beams. B has to pass the stones, and that in the order in which A needs them. For this purpose, they use a language consisting of the words block, pillar, slab, beam. A calls them out. B brings the stone which he has learnt to bring at such and such a call. Conceive this as a complete primitive language.
This is a sneaky example that he gives because, on the one hand, he acts like the description given by Augustine is right. But the description given by Augustine won't be right for this because what's going on is essentially commands. Mm-hmm. He calls them out and then someone brings him something. To set up an example where Augustine is right, the game would have to be, I call out something and then you imagine that in your head or something like that. So it's interesting that he's setting this up as a game in which it's simple enough that Augustine might be right, but of course, Augustine isn't right.
Which is why he picks it, right? Or why he makes it up.
Why he makes up the language?
Yeah.
It's funny, Wes, that the example that you just thought of right there, having to just picture something in your head, that wouldn't even work as a game. That in order for there to be any communication at all, we do the game with little kids, like, where's your nose? And they point to their nose. Where's your ear? And they point to their ear. And that's one of the basic first things that you start messing around with them with when they're learning language. And even that, you could say it's not just ostensive, it's a command. I'm saying point to your ear.
Right.
Right. Wittgenstein, he says something like, children learn language in this weird way. But if you want to stop there and say that's the complete picture of language, like you're missing just about everything. And the process of learning can't be the complete way in which we describe it. And eventually he'll say, like, when he builds to the next level of complexity that he's going to dismiss, he says, so what if you, like, point to 2 nuts and say, that's 2. What's 2? The number of nuts that there are, the nuts themselves, the shape they make sitting there. That could be like a million different things.
Although with that example confuses me, and I think the example is you point at something that's, say, red and say red, but someone might think you're pointing at the shape. But typically you do that multiple times, exactly, right, with different objects, so that person infers what's the thing in common. And if you've ever taken a Berlitz course, that's exactly what happens. You get taught language, and the person doesn't use your native language to teach you. They just use basically ostension and then other more complicated games as well. But in the beginning, so if someone's pointing at a pencil and saying whatever the name in the other language for that is, you'll probably assume it means pencil, but maybe it means yellow, and then they pick up something else that's yellow and say that. And then you say, oh, okay, they don't mean pencil, they mean yellow. Now, I don't know if I'm missing something there, and that maybe...
I think that's why rules are so important later on.
But at this point, right, this is just like the way Socrates approaches the swarm of bees. His question will be, give me the number of things that you're saying that are related in some way, and you're going to ask, by which one thing are they related in common? Having multiplicity on the face of it isn't a problem. The question is whether you can get down to there being a one-to-one correspondence of anything.
There'll always be multiple properties in common between every different object. So you might even think of something as abstract as, say, shape. Well, that has shape, that has shape, that has shape, and you'd never get anywhere. What you really need there is the concept of salience, like what's relevant to human beings. Probably when someone picks up a pencil and then gives me an ostensive definition, I'm probably going to assume pencil for a variety of reasons and not yellow and not more general terms. And that has to do with the pragmatics of the situation, or salience, let's say, which is just a matter of this background where we both have the same sorts of interests and the same sorts of things are relevant to us. That's extremely important to getting anywhere with language. Otherwise, you really would get nowhere.
How do we get, in Wittgenstein's case, to giving up the one-to-one correspondence? Even in the case that we have here before us at the beginning of the philosophical investigations, what's going to be the persuasive part for Wittgenstein that we have to give up that one-to-one correspondence that he wants to give up here? It's not as simple as, well, the pencil could be yellow, it could be wood, it could be long and thin, it could be octagonal in shape, it could have an eraser. That's not a problem. That's just a question of whether or not you've sufficiently demarked it. But he wants to go further, it seems to me, to say that there is ultimately not going to be a one-to-one correspondence between the thing and the language that you use, and that the nature of that interaction with language and the things is not atomistic. And I think it's right to point to the beginning of the book in his examples that he wants to reveal that it's not atomistic there.
So in paragraph 3, he says, Augustine, we might say, does describe a system of communication, but not everything that we call language is this system. I don't think he wants to deny that there can be sentences or phrases that are one-to-one with the pencil. I think he wants to say something more like there are sentences that are language and that fall under the heading of language that aren't one-to-one with the world in any way. So he might demarcate pencil, and that's a guy holding a pencil and pointing to it, and like, pencil, bring me a pencil. And pencil, if your pen was out of ink, all of these different utterances of the word mean completely different things.
Yeah.
And that's the way in which we lose the one-to-one. That's a way in which we lose the one-to-one.
Well, I think even just looking at the ostension, again, unless you're talking about a name for that one particular thing, then you're talking about a general term. You're talking about pencil, which then not only is referring to that, but is referring to a whole bunch of things that you don't see. Right there, it's already not a one-to-one correspondence. In order to retain that, by generalizing it to come up with a philosophical theory in which words have a one-to-one correspondence with reality, then again, you get, a concept like pencil. It stands for the set of all things that will fall under this.
No, I don't think it stands for a set. In early Wittgenstein, the universal itself is just another thing or the concept is what's stood for.
Maybe this is what I remember from Russell anyway.
With a proper name, you get an individual, you get an object. But with a basic property name, that stands for a universal. So what you guys are calling one-to-one, which I take to be just the idea of meaning as reference. The meaning as reference holds in early Wittgenstein with property terms. It's reference to a universal.
See, I thought that ultimately universals were not going to be real, that they are the part of the things that gets atomistically broken up.
The basic atomic sentence is a subject-predicate sentence with a property. And the property stands for universal or concept. It's hard to know how to interpret that and how you want to do the ontology of that. I mean, I think you're right, Mark, in general, but I think for Wittgenstein's early view, the radical referentialist view, meaning is reference. And that's why he's going to, when we get to family resemblances, there's two attacks on referentialism you can take. One is the idea of ostension, which we get here. And then there's the idea that there is even a determinate universal to which to refer. And that's where we'll get the family resemblance attack.
Yes, that is what I was presaging there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as Philosophy Bro points out, it's not clear he wants to say that ostension doesn't occur or that it's not a language game that can occur. But there are other sorts of ways to use language. And not only that, but ostension requires all this background knowledge and even background knowledge of language itself. For ostension to work, there's a lot that needs to already be going on language-wise. So to use it as a bootstrapping mechanism to get you into language is really a problem.
Right. Ostension happens and is legitimate. It just can't be that ostension is all that's going on, or that's even the primary mechanism. Ostension is not language, or it's not all of language. It's just a tool. He's not saying it doesn't happen. Ostension clearly happens, but that can't be the whole story.
Yeah.
I was under the impression that the critique of ostension was like an actual critique of ostension, not simply that ostension was the entirety of the way language gains meaning.
Say more, Seth.
When he's saying that when you point at an object, how do we know that you're picking out the object versus picking out the color? The example I had in mind, he spends a fair amount of time talking about this and that and the act of pointing and how this is X or this is Y can never have meaning outside of its actual use. But if you point at something that's in a pot and has green leaves and you go plant, 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 and then you take this to a child and you take the child outside and there's something that has brown leaves and it's in the ground and you go plant, plant. I thought he was basically trying to say that ostension as an action is not, as Wes pointed out, a bootstrap into language, nor is it somehow the picture of the way that we put language together and it's insufficient. I think what he was trying to say was that even at the root level, ostension is not simply what we take it to be, namely this ascription of a kind of correspondence between a word and an object, because the act of ostension needs to take place in a context, and that ostension is essentially a form of use. Does that make sense?
That sounds right.
Correct. Ostension is a language game in itself.
Okay.
Yep. It is based on convention. So folks that listen to our Heidegger podcast, we talked about Hubert Dreyfus as a main modern scholar of Heidegger. In the lectures on Heidegger, he also talks about Wittgenstein in this context, which is if you think you can, say, program a computer to understand the world by giving it a bunch of symbols and assigning them to things. So maybe you give your computer a little video camera and say, do this ostensive game that we're describing. That in itself is not going to elicit understanding, because what is involved in understanding the way we as humans have it is not just this putting a label on things, but this whole wealth of background practices that set up why we understand ostension in the first place. There's conditioning prior to...
Yeah.
I've got to have a general understanding of other human beings' purposes, because we speak for certain purposes and say a command purpose or to insult or any other different type of purpose. That's some of the background knowledge that I really need to do any interpreting. It can't just be the one type of speech where I'm just labeling. Although, again, I think that is a type of speech, but you can't get very far with just labeling.
That sounds right.
I think that what's important here is this awareness of the intentions and the purposes of others. If I were to offer a criticism here, I would say, well, why can't you point at a number of different things that are red and have someone infer that? And then someone pointed out that there would be multiple properties common to each. But then there's the question of, there's a reason why we fix on some properties and not on others. And that's because we have certain common purposes as human beings, or at least as a certain type of community. And that really narrows things down. So I might say, well, for ostension to work, you need this language background. I might say, why can't it be non-linguistic? Why can't it be, yes, there's lots of background stuff required, but why can't that be itself non-linguistic?
So let's say you manage to communicate red by pointing to lots of different kinds of red objects that differ a lot. So you teach someone red, and then you say red. What are they supposed to do with that? And without some mechanism to indicate what your even purpose of language isn't helpful. Like they would just stare at you blankly, like, yeah, red. Is that a question or a command? So those things can be nonverbal. There has to be some other context in the background.
Well, but I took Wes to be saying something like, why couldn't it just be what comes with the hardware? That is, the mode of human beings, because of our flesh and the particular dispositions of our flesh predicated on evolution even, make us delineate some basic structure of the game regarding expectation, regarding pattern recognition, regarding fundamental notions of causality that aren't philosophical, but they are the activities of our minds and our hardware, so to speak. And that ostension basically works in that context, period. And why isn't that good enough? It might say something important about the contingency of human beings versus other kinds of creatures or anything else. And you might want to then go down the road of trying to understand our own consciousness and so forth. But that we would come with our own set of rules already, a set of algorithms. Let's put it that way.
So, for example, in some context, suppose that you like to eat things, and I know you like to eat things. Suppose you're cooking something, and it doesn't even need to be verbal. You could say, point with a finger or look with your eyes at something, and that might be construed as a command to give me that thing, and I'm going to put it in the pot, let's say, or something like that. What I'm suggesting is that sort of background knowledge, there could be something like that which isn't itself linguistic, which allows us to bootstrap into language. So knowledge of each other's intentions. So for instance, as a kid, you learn the hard way that pointing for dogs doesn't work, right? That's kind of infuriating. They're just going to look at your finger. But they're looking at your finger. That's a kind of great example of failure of ostension, because they're taking it as, look at my finger. But if they knew something more about your intentions, if they were capable of understanding your desires and your particular purposes in the world, they would understand that you're, let's say, pointing for them to go outside. That background understanding, I'm saying, there may be some level where that's not necessarily linguistic, and that can ground basic linguistic activity.
I'm not sure if I see how this is against what Wittgenstein is ultimately arguing for, right?
Because later on, I think the implication is that ostension requires language to already be in place to work.
I don't think it requires that language already be in place. It just requires other kinds of instruction around it, or other sorts of assumptions to go with it. So when you look at the language of two, and later on he talks about like what it's like to teach that language, and just it's what you're talking about, right? Like children in this tribe, someone points and like slab, and then they keep pointing until the child picks it up, and then, oh, you want me to, like, you keep saying it and pointing, got that that's a slab. You know, they just keep it up angrily, so the child picks it up, and then they learn, like, oh, it's a command. So I don't think there has to be other language in place so much as there's some sort of background. And Wittgenstein seems agnostic as to what that background is. I think you're probably right that, like, we naturally follow some rules better than others because those rules are either evolutionary advantageous or part of human nature, or however you want to describe that. But I don't think he wants to say other language has to be in place, just that ostensive training is never just ostensive training.
Is it anything different than saying that you need more than pointing? You at least need repeated pointing. And that repeated pointing amounts to a rule. And so is that really different than there being at least a presumption of causality? So when I was reading through this, I kept on thinking of sort of Hume's critique of causality. Mm-hmm. And the idea that there really is no such thing as causality. There's just things that we associate as happening one after the other. And this seems to me to be a lot like what Wittgenstein is saying about language and ostension, that what you get out of it is a rule that associates one thing to another. Then the private language argument would work like, look, you can't have a rule if you only have one thing. It doesn't make a rule because there's no causality, because it doesn't have any association with the next thing. But once you have an association, a pattern that goes from one to the other, anything kind of thing that has a implication that would gather into itself another thing, to have a prediction, to have an expectation, that becomes a rule. And that is the beginning of a language. Sidestepping for a second the criticism of whether or not you can have a private language, the notion of causality seems to be what he means by, or what he's entailing with, this notion of language in the end.
Right. Some sort of association. I mean,
isn't that all causality is for Hume, at least? We could separate a question of causality being something more than association, but it's at least association.
We're speaking about psychological terms, though, where he's going to reject the idea of a rule in the mind, right, that governs all this stuff. And we don't really get a picture of how it's internalized. We just get a grounding in the practice of the community, the form of life. So it seems a very external public thing.
It might be a presumption of causality. It might be that you're wrong in doing that, just like the way Hume criticizes us for being that way. It might come with the hardware that that's the way we do our pattern recognition, and we extrapolate causality when there isn't, or that it doesn't matter if there is or isn't, that we turn association in time between events with causality. But that's the kind of thing it seems to me that he's pointing towards. Wittgenstein is.
Well, the idea is that we've been trained, right? We've been trained to react in a certain way to other people's...
Why do we have to be trained? It doesn't go further into us than being trained, and it has to go further than that, right? Otherwise, we couldn't figure anything out. Otherwise, we'd only have in ourselves the ability to do what we were taught. But the fact that we can figure something out means that it has to be more than merely being trained.
Well, he likes the word training, right? He's fond of that word. I think he's fond of it because it gives you this sense of doing something unconsciously, maybe, or again, it goes against the idea that you're going to ground this in having a mental image. So, for instance, when you run into a signpost along the road and it tells you to go somewhere, there isn't this conscious mental interpretation thing going on to figure that out. It's really just second nature, where you behave in a certain way that you've been trained to behave when you see this sign. That's why I think the word training is important.
Can we then say that language, I think the reason he talks about language games and talks about this simple language with the slab and all that stuff is really that what language is just a collection of these language games that have built on each other. And you could even imagine, like the one that you just mentioned about, I see the sign and I go, what you could loosely call a language game that doesn't even involve language at all, but involves more generally some symbol system. Or would you even call it a system if it's only one type of symbol? But I guess the fact that it's used repeatedly and you're trained in it, well, maybe that's enough to make it a system of some sort. It's enough to make it a game.
Yeah, and there's a reason for calling it a game, right? Because games can be so different from each other. It can be so many different purposes, and language can have so many different purposes that we've talked about above and beyond describing. So commanding, insulting, all that stuff.
Right, and also because games have rules, right? So that...
Yeah, and then the rule thing.
You can be wrong. There are incorrect moves in chess. In the same way, there's a right way to respond to that sign, and there's a wrong way to respond to that sign. And, well, maybe people in different cultures do it differently. Well, those people are playing different games. They don't have the same symbol system going, whatever. Within a given community, there's only one way to go for that particular circumstance.
So then the question becomes the relationship between rules and meaning, because... And this is what I was just talking about before, because it's not going to turn out that understanding a rule in the mind is the way we grasp meaning.
It's not the same thing as use?
Knowing how to use a thing is grasping meaning, right? There's not like a single rule for using a word. Instead, it's sort of these weird emergent rules that you probably can't describe completely.
Take the chess example again. What does it mean subjectively to grasp the rule of how a piece moves in chess. If you tried to say, what is the particular mental image or something associated with that, you really couldn't say what it is. And even if you did, you'd need another rule to interpret that.
I think the better way so think of chess pieces as like their particular movements as definitions, right? So we know the rook moves along ranks and files, but it turns out that understanding how the rook moves doesn't mean you understand the meaning of a rook. To understand the meaning of a rook is to know how to use it in context, in games. So if you know to keep rooks behind past pawns, and for those of you listeners who don't play chess, do that, except when you shouldn't, that's how you know the meaning of a rook. But he's saying something like, knowing a word doesn't mean knowing its definition, and analogously, knowing how a chess piece moves isn't enough to say you know the meaning of that piece. You have to know how it fits into a context and what it can do. And when you understand how to use it, that's when you say you mean it. I think chess is actually a super good analogy. I don't know if it was intentional. When you ask people, like, do you know how to play chess? The answer is never like yes or no. The answer is like, oh, well, I know how the pieces move. And that uncertainty is exactly what you get in language. It's like, do you know Spanish? I know some words and occasionally how to put them together, but I'm not fluent in Spanish. You get similar sort of responses with respect to chess. So I think with meaning, he's saying, like, you got to know how to use it. Even if you know the definition, that's not enough to say you know the word.
Right. By extension, you don't know how, when a word is taken out of its usual context, there might just not be a rule that tells how it's supposed to work in that new context. It's just not part of that new language game. And to preview, he thinks that's where we get a lot of our philosophical difficulties, is that we take language out of its context and we don't know what to do with it.
But I think it's also important that the grounding of our use in language isn't in the grasping of rules. He's arguing against the idea that the conscious mental grasping of a rule grounds our use of language.
This is a live issue, the Hubert Dreyfus thing that I was mentioning before. He thinks that people who are trying to program computers, artificial intelligence, are acting on the faulty assumption that language is a matter of understanding rules. And so if you just program enough rules, of how rooms are made up and how objects fit in rooms, if you just write enough individual statements down, then eventually that will somehow result in understanding. But if you, like Wittgenstein, fundamentally reject that, then you're just going entirely the wrong way.
Wes, so when you say it grounds our use of language, do you just mean something like, he's saying it's not the case that language is grounded by rules?
Yeah, it's not grounded by, although language doesn't always involve definite rules, right?
Right.
He talks about the disappearing chair in 90, I think. And so we have to be careful about rules in that sense as well. But one of the important points is that it's the mental grasping of a rule is not how we grasp meaning. Grasping meaning is a know-how.
Right.
It's a being able to use the word. It's not this mental event. Try and think about what it would mean mentally to grasp a rule. It's kind of difficult to say, right? You can't just bring up an image and say, okay, there's the rule. On the other hand, you could say, well, we have to internalize these rules somehow, right? And that becomes the question. And I would say, well, that internalization is largely unconscious. I would want to call it mental still, although I think Wittgenstein is arguing against that. But it's mental, but it's not conscious. We have dispositions. These dispositions have to be internalized in some way. But I think Wittgenstein wants to avoid talking about that internalization.
He doesn't want to say that there aren't rules, or that language lacks rules, or that somehow those rules aren't really language. I think he just wants to say that's not the whole picture. And in fact, we were talking about very early on about how, like, Nietzsche gets to write in aphorisms. Wittgenstein gets to write in strange paragraphs. Emily Dickinson gets to start sentences with and. Those are the sorts of rules, like don't start sentences with conjunctions, that children learn, and they're like good rules for clarity and for learning a language. And then later on, those rules, it's like, you shouldn't do this thing, except when you should. And it all becomes context sensitive. So the rules sort of fall away. But they serve mostly as ways to learn language. They're scaffolds to learn rather than defining parameters. I actually wrote a paper way back in the day in which I essentially argued that chess is a language in the way that Wittgenstein sort of defines language, like that analogy is not accidental, which is why I'm so fond of using that to extrapolate Wittgenstein's meaning. And you get into like fairy chess pieces as very strange poetry.
Wes, you said that understanding the word is being able to use it. And you were kind of getting at Wittgenstein makes a point early on to say, what would it even mean to have a mental state where you were sort of mentally using a word but not actually using it in language?
Or mentally grasping a rule as a way of understanding the meaning of something.
Yeah, understanding the meaning somehow. This anticipates the latter half of the book where he talks more about mental states, but he says early on, what would it even mean to use the block, pillar, stone example? He says, do you think that when the builder A yells out stone with an exclamation point, it's as if there's a sentence in builder B's head that says, oh, that is the command for me to go pick up the stone and hand it to him. What would it even mean to have a mental representation that somehow the word stone with an exclamation point issued as a command is a shortening of a much longer sentence that says, go pick up the stone and hand it to me. And he says, what would that even mean outside of the use of the word and the actions associated with it, right?
Yeah.
And what I thought you were saying was that until you can say the word and essentially use it in the way that it is intended to be used in that context, that you don't understand the meaning. But we know that people grasp meaning prior to their ability to vocalize and articulate. So I wondered if maybe there is kind of a way in which you have to be able to understand the meaning by being able to understand how a word is meant to be used, even if you can't use it yourself.
In what sense can't you use it? You can't vocalize it?
Yes.
Okay. And again, in the sense that like you're too young to vocalize it, or sort of when I listen to someone speaking Spanish, I know what they mean, but I can't repeat it back to them, something like that.
No, I'm thinking in terms of language acquisition. We know, for example, that comprehension precedes the ability to vocalize or to write.
I may have learned what recalcitrant means in an SAT book, but can I really use it in a sentence? And no, usually not at first.
And yet you might...
I have to see it a number of times in use before I can actually really use it.
But can you imagine a circumstance? I'm thinking of the learning or developmental example. The children learn the meaning of things prior to their ability to actually use them. But that's a good enough example, Wes, where you could say, you can identify, you can recognize when the word recalcitrant is being used correctly or not, but you may not be able to correctly use it in a sentence. Is Wittgenstein saying that doesn't even make sense?
In the acquisition case, I think he would probably back off saying, like, children who can't speak don't know any words. I know children like who knew sign language before they could speak. They used signs, and knowing the appropriate context for those means they probably knew the meaning of those signs. But I think in the case that Wes is talking about, like, I can recognize when recalcitrant is being used incorrectly or it doesn't make sense in this analogy, even though I can't speak it. I think Wittgenstein wants to say, no, you don't really know that word. You're like kind of familiar with it, but you don't really grasp that word.
And yet you can identify whether or not something is a game without being able to give a definition of it. If I change that, instead of saying Wes doesn't know how to use it properly, but he couldn't give a definition of it, are those two different examples?
So being able to give a definition is not a sufficient condition, or even a necessary condition to knowing how to use a word. Like, that's a separate thing.
Giving definitions is its own language game.
This is a good counterexample, I think, to Wittgenstein, because obviously someone who can just give a definition but can't use the word fully does have some concept of the meaning of the word. So obviously there is something important to meaning in grasping a definition. It's not everything, but I think it's actually the criticism of Wittgenstein.
Well, it seems perfectly in accord with Wittgenstein to say that it's a matter of degree, that there are different levels, that there's not a fact of the matter whether you understand the word or fail to understand the word. It's more complicated than that, depending on the different uses that it might be put.
No, I'm not saying he's not being gradation-y enough.
Not enough grayscale on Wittgenstein.
Speaking of SAT words...
He's saying semantics amount to use, right? Meaning amounts to use. And he's arguing against any sort of semantic notion which involves you having some sort of mental content in your mind. And I think Seth's example is a case where it is a matter of mental content and not the use of rules. Now, Wittgenstein might say, well, you couldn't give someone a definition of a word until the language game were already in place. It's like ostension or something like that. But I think the basic point is that you can't simply argue that meaning is solely use. Meaning goes beyond use. In fact, meaning may not even be primarily use, but that's another. Use is important to meaning, but there's something to it that...
Well, I think what I'm trying to drive at is we can go down the path with Wittgenstein and talk about meaning as use. I'm asking myself this question about how is it not possible that you can have a mental representation, a mental state, an understanding of the meaning of something outside of its use?
How can you not have that?
Yeah, how would it be possible for you to say you only know something when you can use it correctly, but you have some knowledge of its use that is not its use? You have some understanding of how it is to be used that is not itself use.
So, Seth, you're presenting the question, even if you were to use it wrong, it wouldn't be the use that somebody else had. However you spoke the word, it would imply a use of some sort. So how could you possibly use the word without having it imply a use of the word?
Can we get an example? Is there some way to make this a little clearer?
There has to be an example where I see or I hear a word used and I understand when a word is being used correctly or incorrectly, but I never actually use the word myself. It could be in a foreign language, for example. Like, let's say I watch those telenovelas in Spanish, and I never speak Spanish to anybody, but when I watch the telenovelas, I know that when the woman dramatically comes in on, the couple making love, and she says, and says the Spanish word for infidelity, I know exactly what she's saying. I understand its use. I understand. And in my head, somehow I have an understanding of that.
You don't have the know-how to use it, though, but you do know its meaning. I think it's a perfect example, Seth, but you just...
What do I have, then?
You just have a familiarity or a passing acquaintance, but you don't really understand that word.
But I think you do know its meaning. I think this is the thing. I think Seth is right. He knows meaning without use, and I think that's a counterexample.
Wait. Why is it meaning without use?
It just seems it's a single ostension.
Because Seth cannot use the Spanish word for infidelity. He doesn't know how to use it. He doesn't have the know-how.
Well, so, okay, what we're saying is that we can have recognition without use. It's like saying, I know what the good essay is, but I can't write one.
In common day parlance, we would say Seth knows the meaning.
But doesn't know how to do it.
It's fine to define meaning as use and then say, therefore, he doesn't know the meaning. But most of us would agree he knows meaning there without use.
I think that Seth got lucky there because he's acquired the word in something like ostensive. Yes. She rode in a horse and her husband's with another woman and she was angry and she said this word. Probably means infidelity. And he happened to be right. But take the word nonplussed, which means the exact opposite of what everyone thinks it means. And if you were like, oh man, you know what his problem is? He's so cool under pressure. He's really nonplussed. Most people feel like, oh, I know what that word means now. But they don't. It means something different. Seth got lucky and made the right association.
Why is that a problem?
I think the point is someone could give you a definition of an unfamiliar word,
right,
and that definition gives you some grasp of the meaning, which is not use-based. So not everything about meaning is use-based. That's the problem. In fact, it's not clear that use is really even the bulk of what meaning is. Even though I accept Wittgenstein's insights there, I think the idea of a definition, for instance, giving you the meaning of something, even though you're hobbled with respect to use, is quite compelling.
But hold on, use is not a matter of being able to say the word yourself. Use just means that you can react appropriately when you hear it. So the fact that Seth has understood what is going on in this, so he has used that word to assess the situation or something like that, then that's all that's required.
No, use is you have to know how to use it.
No, because the slab, remember the game of the slab, beam, block, pillar, in that particular case, only one guy is talking. The other guy understands him and shows that he understands by responding with the appropriate action. He doesn't have to use the words at all.
Right.
Well, but it does seem to be that there's a distinction between recognizing what the use of it is. So in the case of the slab, beam, pillar, one person is giving the command and the other person is interpreting the command. And that in interpreting it, they understand use. And that's what's meant by use. It's not required that they also then go and give commands as a demonstration that they actually know how to use it. It's sufficient that they recognize the command and do the appropriate action. And that is the corollary to what Seth's doing, is that he recognizes the infidelity exclamation, even though he might not be able to roll his R's.
What's the use there?
The litmus test for my use, Wes, would be either I would have to be married and walk in on my wife cheating on me and then yell infidelidad, or conversely, I would have to be married and cheat on my wife, have her come in and in Spanish yell at me infidelidad and understand that what she was saying was she was accusing me of infidelity. Yes.
Right.
And the second case is the case of recognition without necessarily using.
So what he's saying when he says meaning is use doesn't mean you use the word correctly, as in like that's an event that happens. It's just if I say, Seth, do you know what infidelidad means? If you can recite a definition of infidelidad, that doesn't justify you answering that question yes. What justifies you answering yes, I do know what infidelidad means is, were you in a situation where you had to determine if something was infidelidad or not? You could do that accurately and convey or be told that it is infidelidad. It's more like capacity for use, right, than actual usage.
Right. I think Mark's point is well taken that, use could amount to being the recipient of a command, for instance.
It's just doing what you're supposed to in the language game.
Right.
Right. But the point is here that there's an element to when you give a definition of something, that description, that meaning, that mental content that you get from that, which Wittgenstein rejects as having anything to do with meaning, does have something to do with meaning. Knowing how to use a word is grounded in situations where you use it. It's not grounded in this mental content. Someone telling you what infidelity means doesn't add anything to your ability to use that word, as far as I can tell for Wittgenstein. Your use of the word infidelity, your being able to use it, is grounded in actual other instances of use around you or in being drawn into the game. It's never grounded in someone giving you an idea of what but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just being too strict.
Even in the way you described it, I took Seth's example as being, if you recognized what the word was implying or saying, then it wasn't necessary that when you walked in on your wife, you exclaimed an infidelidad, but that when that was exclaimed in your presence, you recognized what was meant by that. That was sufficient for use.
This is the point I'm making, that's an intuitive thing to say, right? That receiving that definition and being able to recognize it could ground some sort of rudimentary use. But I think, maybe I'm just being wrong about how radical Wittgenstein is, I think he wants to reject any concept of meaning that's grounded in this subjective mental content.
I was originally asking the question, and I'll, as I do, bring it back to the text. I don't really know where we are, but in sections 19 and 20, he's talking about slab with an exclamation point, and he says, is the call slab a sentence or a word? If it's a word, surely it has not the same meaning of the like-sounding word in our ordinary language, for it is a call. But if it is a sentence, is it a shortening of the sentence, bring me a slab? So when I shout slab exclamation point, and I command somebody, slab, that's really the equivalent, if you will, of bring me a slab in our ordinary language. So I'm trying to put myself in a situation, since I can't imagine a four-word language like this, I can't put myself in a state where I imagine myself in this language. But he asks in section 20, does what the person mean when they yell slab exclamation point, bring me a slab? Or because meaning is in use and because of the language dependency, if you don't have the words bring me in your language, what exactly does he mean when he says slab exclamation point? And I kind of want to say there's some mental content in the absence of language where Builder B understands that they're to go and pick up a slab and bring it over, and that has to have some mental content associated with it, even if it's all wrapped up with slab, because there are four words in the language and each one implies an action, and that action is shared across them. It's just a different object, that there would have to be some meaning, some non-linguistic mental meaning that would be associated with the words that the builder would know. My job is to go move over here, pick this thing up and bring it over here. And the thing that I pick up is either a slab, a beam, or a pillar, right?
But off of what sort of mental content could you read off the rules or read off the know-how, right? You'd have to be able to do something with that mental content in order to get your know-how, in order to squeeze, let's say, that know-how out of it. I'm arguing for Wittgenstein's point now. It's hard to see how you could connect that mental content to know-how. When you really start looking at it, what sort of conscious mental content could you have? An image or something like that, where you could say, just attending to it in my mind would suddenly reveal to me the sorts of things that I need to know to respond to the word slab by going and getting a slab. It's unclear how you make that connection.
Let's break this down into its component parts. There are 4 words in this language, each of which is a command. The components of the command, when it's shouted out by worker A, is worker B has to physically move himself to some pile of stuff, bend down, pick something up, and carry it over to builder A. Now, I'm having a hard time getting my mind wrapped around the idea that there isn't some kind of mental content associated with the activity of picking up, let's say. Now, this language does not have the words for pick up. The activity of picking up is part of the use of all 4 of those words. Doesn't matter what command it is, there's use associated with it, and that use always has the component of picking up and carrying. And yet you have to imagine that Builder B has in his head or her head some kind of mental content associated with the activity of picking up, because that's part of the use, even if it's buried inside of the one-word command.
I'm not sure what the thrust of that is, right? So I see what you're saying. Like, if we wanted to add a 5th object like lamp, it would be way easier to teach B to pick up and bring the lamp than it was to teach him the slab, because now he knows with all 4 things we've got, all of these words mean pick up the thing and take it over. So if we introduced a new thing and we're like lamp, it would take like 1 or 2 for him to start picking up lamps rather than like the 20 it might have taken to teach him the first thing. But what's the thrust of that? That mental content doesn't need language to be represented?
Well, Seth, you seem to be saying that mental content is necessary to mediate between the utterance of the word by one worker and then the action on the part of the other worker, right?
I guess what I'm saying is, in the same way that Wittgenstein is asking the question in 19 and 20, does slab as a command mean the same thing as bring me a slab, right? If language is in the use, and the use has all of these different elements associated with it, where does the activity of picking up, which can be understood as a discrete action, fit into the use of this word? How does it have meaning separate from this word without there being a word for it?
I think, though, he's arguing against mental content.
I know.
Okay. So whether or not you use slab or bring me a slab, either one is good as long as it's associated with the action of going to get a slab. And then it's not like you hear the word slab and then you have some sort of mental imagery go to your head. And probably this doesn't usually happen, right? If we're working on a site and someone says it to do, it's pretty automatic. It's not like there's some mental imagery that goes through our head. And for many words, you know, what mental imagery goes to your head when you hear the word language or when you hear various other words? Most of our use of language is not generating these internal mental images. And then even if it did, how do you translate that mental image into going and getting a slab? So you would still have the problem, even if you could produce some sort of mental content there, you're still ultimately getting a kind of brute association.
Right.
So the brute association for Wittgenstein, I think, ends up being between the use of the word and then the going and getting of the slab.
Right. I think that because of the simplicity of this language, go and get this thing, that idea of picking up is contained even in an utterance. Like, to be a word being uttered conveys as much as go pick up that thing. It's like a doctor in surgery who says scalpel and gets one.
Right.
So where is the mental content of that being a command? It just is a command.
I understand that. And if I'm belaboring the point and I'm wildly off topic, just kill the thread.
No, I think this is crucial. I think
we have 4 words in this language.
Right.
Pillar, beam, slab, and stone, or whatever they are, block. Each one is shouted out as a command. 99% of the content of each one of those commands is identical. Go get me a... The only variable is what object gets picked up. So in this case, the use for all of these things is identical.
Right.
The only difference is the object itself that gets picked up. So what I'm kind of asking myself is, if you're the worker B and you say, okay, well, worker B understands the meaning of slab and block and beam and pillar, Actually, he understands the same thing. It's one thing that he understands. And because the use of slab and the use of pillar overlap, 90% of the use is identical. There's only one thing that's different. Then I don't understand how worker B could not create some kind of understanding or meaning that's associated with that 90% that those four words have in common, and think of it as somehow having a meaning that is separate from those four words.
I think Wittgenstein is eventually going to agree with you when he talks about all of the different ways to categorize phrases and to think about different kinds of language. Like, that's a valid interpretation. And there's also the interpretation of what's going on that no, all four of these words, he hasn't made the connection for some reason. We can't know if he's made the connection between all four things or if they're accidentally all the same, but in his mind, he's like, oh, slab is completely and utterly different in every way from brick. Like, we have no idea what's going on in his mind. And all we can tell from the outside is he understands commands in the same way or with the same unity that we might understand a tone of voice. We can articulate, like, the way the doctor said it was in a particular context and with a certain briskness, and that's what made it a command. And we can articulate that because we have words for those things. Since B doesn't have words for those things, he can't articulate it, and it might be exactly the way you're describing it. Maybe he does think of everything as like, yep, pick up, and then I'm listening for what I'm picking up. And what Wittgenstein in 20 is saying seems to me like, how would we know the difference?
You're absolutely right. Later on, it becomes clear that the only measure we have by which to judge is the external actions, right? We have no privileged access to B's mental states to be able to say. I'm just kind of making an appeal to you guys and saying, can you even conceive of how it would be possible for B to not have some conception of the idea of picking up? Like, clearly not all the stones and blocks and all that stuff weigh the same amount. And so some things will be easier for B to pick up and some things will be harder for B to pick up. And maybe some things B can't even pick up. Or maybe at the end of the day, it's just something's too heavy. Even if we only have those four words of the language, in my gut, I feel like B.
Wittgenstein.
Yeah, that got dark fast. So Wittgenstein.
Last time we covered a lot of the overall themes. So maybe this time I had suggested that we just pick out passages that we know we especially wanted to talk about and then read them and then talk about them. And then that way we'll maybe get through more than 5 pages. Does that sound reasonable?
I think so, yeah.
Sure.
Well, the first one I had on my little list was number 22. 22, I think, might be the only spot where he name drops Gottlob Frege, who we had an episode on a while ago. And it says, Frege's idea that every assertion contains an assumption, which is the thing that is asserted, really rests on the possibility found in our language of writing every statement in the form, it is asserted that such and such is the case. But that such and such is the case is not a sentence in our language. So far, it is not a move in the language game. And if I write not, it is asserted that, but it is asserted, such and such is the case, the words it is asserted simply become superfluous. We might write every statement in the form of a question followed by a yes. Is it raining? Yes. Would this show that every statement contained a question? Etc. So this is referring not only to Frege, but also to Wittgenstein's earlier idea that language is fundamentally about making assertions. And that if you have something else, well, maybe you could come up with like an assertion. If you say, I doubt that you speak English, you have to analyze that in terms of what would the primary, okay, there's a proposition in there, you speaking English, but he says, well, that's actually, here he says, that is not itself an assertion. As soon as you look at anything the least bit difficult, he thinks that this idea that everything can be reduced to assertion falls apart.
Just for background, Frege is part of his logical calculus that he developed.
Right.
Which led to our mathematical logic. He had a sign, a symbol for assertion. I don't remember what it looked like exactly. I think it preceded the sentence, right? To say this is being asserted.
Right. And so you could have different modalities of the same proposition. Yeah. Is it being asserted? Is it being questioned? Is it being doubted? Whatever. Frege and those folks want to say that the assertion is the basic one. But Wittgenstein says, well, why would you necessarily assume that? And 23 says, but how many kinds of sentences are there? Say assertion, question, command. There are countless kinds, countless different kinds of use of what we call symbols, words, sentences. And this multiplicity is not something fixed given once and for all, but new types of language, new language games, as we may say, come into existence and others become obsolete and get forgotten. This is kind of I found the coolest part of the book, just that this giant list that he gives of different, if you think asserting is the basic one, he says, review the multiplicity of language games in the following examples and in others. Giving orders and obeying them, describing the appearance of an object or giving its measurement, constructing an object from a description, a drawing, reporting an event, speculating about an event, forming and testing a hypothesis, presenting the results of an experiment in tables and diagrams, making up a story and reading it, play acting, singing catches, guessing riddles, making a joke, telling it, solving a problem in practical arithmetic, translating from one language to another, asking, thanking, cursing, greeting, praying, etc. And it ends, it is interesting to compare the multiplicity of the tools in language and of the ways in which they are used, the multiplicities of kinds of words in sentence, with what logicians have said about the structure of language, including the author of the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus.
That guy was a dick.
Namely, moi.
So that was thought-provoking to me, that, yeah, okay, unless you were of the mind, like you were expressing last time, Dylan, that, like, well, why would you think assertion is basic? Why would you think you can reduce everything to, logical symbology because it was that simple?
I think it's worth articulating why you might not think it, at least, or what is the contrast that he's unearthing here. The note that I had about this section was that he was saying that assertions involve expectations. So our assertions are not expectations, but language involves expectations. That's one of the ways I understood him to be claiming that what language is doing in a sentence is not an assertion. Saying that it's an assertion is not enough. Mm-hmm. That's the short version of his criticism, is that you do have assertions, but assertions don't characterize language completely and sufficiently. And this goes right to his notion that he wants to keep calling it a game, in that the rules are different and, in fact, innumerable for the different kinds of games. And this is what I meant why I was thinking about it in terms of expectations, because a lot of a game involves what you expect to be happening either next or the implication of what has happened now for what you should expect in the future. That is, you're following rules. So, your expectations imply rules, and rules allow you to structure expectations. So I guess that's why, to me, the distinction he was making was that language is about expectations and not about assertions.
That might be part of his point. I don't know if that's his point here, though. I think that, that's all right. And he's certainly saying that assertion is not at the bottom of how language works. Nor can you say that here are the 4 things at the bottom of every language: assertion, doubt, question, command. And that's everything. I mean, Frege's work in the philosophy of language is really sort of ancillary to his logical work. He's trying to find ways to connect his logic work to language so that he can do his project more easily. And Wittgenstein is saying, you can't cross that gap. You can't just come up with a sign and say, oh, here's an assertion. Beautiful. And then that's all that indicates, and there you are. There's no reason to think that at the bottom of even that particular kind of sentence is one form of assertion.
Say more about that. Or explain it more, right? Right now, what you're saying is a kind of ostension. You're invoking Wittgenstein pointing. And maybe that's all he's doing in section 23, is he's just pointing at, look at all these examples of language games that aren't characterizable by assertions. And if he fully spelled it out, he would give the same exact sentence and say that I could have them manifest each one of those ways of having a language game with exactly the same sentence. And maybe that's all that he's going to do, is, as an act of ostension, point to the fact that language acts as a language game. It seems to be unpackable more than that you can point to the failure of assertion as being the end all of language without just pointing at it.
Right. He's not just pointing and saying, look at all these other things. He's making the point, and these other things also will characterize a language. I'm not saying no, Frege had it wrong having 4 things. Really, there are 20 things. You can't just say these are the number of things there are, because new things are constantly emerging. So I just don't think he's talking about rules here, rules and expectation. He's just saying new things are constantly emerging.
What is it about language that's doing that?
Probably that there are multiple players doing this thing.
Well, there are multiple human activities and intentions and human beings want to accomplish, right?
Well, but multiple isn't the same thing as innumerable, right? He's saying that he's not numerable, right? So for this to really work for him, and I'm on board with it, but I'm just trying to see where it is that you're going to say it's innumerable. What's the argument for that?
It has to be that, I mean, even you can see from some of these examples, I don't know if we're actually going to find an argument in here because that's not the way he works, but from some of these examples that, a number of them seem to be different kinds of assertions, right? It's not like assertions and questions and commands are fundamentally different. I guess what I'm trying to get at is trying to figure out what it is to do an examination of language. Like we think that traditionally, maybe you have the syntax, so you can talk about what is grammatical and did you use the plural verb with the plural noun and did you have a noun in the sentence at all? That kind of stuff. Just will a sentence make sense? And then you have the semantics, which to me has always meant, what do the words mean? And the easiest way to think about that is just, what do they refer to just in this sort of ostensive way? And you understand, well, okay, maybe the word and isn't ostensive. You just figure that out by context when you have enough other things, enough nouns that are ostensive, enough verbs that you can, see someone running and say run, etc. And so you build up something, and then that's it for a theory of language. You've got the syntax, you've got the semantics. And a part of that complete semantics then would be to, if you're getting to the sentence level, to distinguish between commands and questions and statements, but it wouldn't really go beyond that socially, right? You'd say, I'm done with my theory of language now. But I think what Wittgenstein is saying is that you just can't make this distinction between semantics and the social uses of words.
Right.
As long as there could be other things people could be doing socially, and we could make up a game right now that every time I say the forbidden word that is Philosophy Bro's real name, everybody's going to go, at me. So there, we just made up a new language game. So now the forbidden word sort of doesn't just refer to him anymore. Right. It is meant to elicit this response and have me correct myself and say, I'll edit that out, whatever.
So it's the lack of a lookup table. When we say multiplicity, we're meaning multiplicity of meaning. There isn't a one-to-one correspondence. A joke is a perfect example here. The fact that you can have irony, things like that.
Right. So I think what drives the multiplicity and the innumerability is the innumerability of ways there are to live, right? Where he thinks like language games are forms of life, the reason we can't just strictly enumerate the number of ways to use language is because we can't strictly enumerate the ways people can be or do, and language is as far out as that. So he's saying something like, for Frege's project to work, it needs to be the case that people only do 5 things. They assert, they doubt, they question, they command, they joke. And that's all. Everything people do can be reduced to those 5 things. And since we can't reduce it to those 5 or to 20, we can't reduce language to that either. And there isn't a separate kind of language that does access those 5 things in general. That's just not how language works.
And I think the implication here is that this throws a wrench in the idea that you're going to develop this ideological calculus that in any way does justice to the way language is really used. I mean, I think when Frege and Wittgenstein developed this calculus, I think they thought that everything important could be reduced to it, right? Even if language has complexity, ultimately all that complexity can be reduced to these very simple atomic statements, which are essentially descriptive. They're essentially trying to link language to these facts or states of affairs in the world. The point here is that much of what goes on in language is not descriptive in that way.
Well, so I think it's important that the multiplicity has to do with the ways, right? So, for instance, in these cases of different language games that he gives lists of, in the individual terms, we would say, well, I sort of know what those individual terms mean. But when I use these different language games, I realize that, in fact, they mean different things than even what I might have thought they meant. And that's where this multiplicity is coming in. It's both the multiplicity of the ways I can use the language in terms of the rules, the individual games, like praying or reporting an event or constructing, but also the way that folds in on the meaning of the individual words. So it's not even as if individual words are atomic, and then you have, following the calculus notion, that each of these games amount to just different sorts of rules or functions. He has to have it be the case that the atoms themselves are multiple in their meanings.
There are no atoms.
There are no atoms, yes. Because if there were atoms and you just had a multiplicity of functions, you would still have something just more complicated than Frege's description, right?
Right.
It has to be that the meaning of the words gets affected by the games themselves. It would be like having the X and Y values in a function get affected by the function itself.
Right.
I think what makes this hard to understand then, the way you're describing it, which is apt, that is, maybe we don't mean by these words what we think we mean. Well, that seems ridiculous because isn't meaning something we're aware of? I know what I mean. And so he spends half the book arguing against that notion of meaning.
Yeah, very counterintuitive.
Yeah, that seems right. So just to clarify, when I say there are no atoms, I don't mean like it's impossible for a word to be atomic. He thinks there are very clear contexts in which words serve in that sort of atomic role, where like, that dog lives there, and that's pretty simple. But I can say that same sentence and actually be saying, my best friend constantly pisses off his girlfriend. And I'm like, oh yeah, that dog lives there. Same atoms, and I'm doing air quotes. For the listener at home, I'm doing air quotes. Same atoms, but completely different meaning. So there are atoms except when there aren't. And it turns out there are usually not.
Yeah, he argues at certain places in this against the old idea that you could just decompose every complex description into atoms, right? To atomic sentences. Because for the early Wittgenstein, the idea was that, well, there's some dispute, but at least for Russell, it's pretty clear that a statement like the dog is there could be further decomposed until you get to these logically simple atomic statements, which I don't even know what they would be, right? But you would be reducing everything as much as possible into its parts and then making statements about those parts.
Right. For Russell, they were phenomenal. You know, there's a red patch in this corner of my field of vision. And for Wittgenstein, we could not figure out what the hell he meant.
Yeah, it's almost like, you know, you're creating a computer program and you're building the dog pixel by pixel, and the atomic statements describe the location and color of every pixel, let's say. And then any statement about the dog is a compound statement, descriptive statement, which is logically related and can be broken down into all the atomic sentences.
Right. So if you knew all the atomic facts, all the state of all the atomic sentences, then you could derive every other truth that could be.
Right.
Yeah, and that turns on the fact that you have to have both the atomic sentences and that there is only one set of ways of relating them, or a numerable, explicit, determined set of ways of relating them.
Right. They're either true or false, the atomic ones.
And you need to be able to verify things, right?
Yeah, but saying that they're either true or false has to do with the relations, because it's more than just the atoms themselves. It also has to do with the way they're related to one another. And this game business has to do with there being a multiplicity of relations, and that reflects back on the putative atoms themselves.
I think that the notion of game is more his way of pointing out that in any particular language, a language game is an interaction among persons according to rules that they all sort of agree on. And the fact that we have lots of language games going on at any given time is just the indicator that we are at any given time interacting according to lots of different sets of rules that with different people we will agree on in different ways. But the notion of a game is, I think, just his way of isolating, this is just some very small set of rules that you're interacting according to in this interaction that you all agree on.
We're making moves,
right,
and those moves can be right or wrong according to the way the game is played, according to the practice of the community.
Right.
But you don't have to even be playing the same game, right? I mean, isn't that comes along with this?
As what? Someone to whom you're talking?
You do, for it to make sense to someone, you do have to be able to...
No.
They at least have to be able to figure out your game. Otherwise, what you're doing is not meaningful to them. It's nonsense to them.
So it could be nonsense. That's one possibility, right? A good example would be where I simply don't understand the other person's language, right? I'm just listening to them speak. I don't have the benefit of any other kind of information, and it's just nonsense. But of course, there are plenty of other cases where I understand, or I think I understand what they're saying, but I am operating and understanding it under a different set of rules, a different language game. And so therefore, from the standpoint of the other person, I'm confused. But I understand exactly what they're saying in terms of my language game. And so you end up getting in a discussion about, sorting out exactly what you mean by something.
I think the problem here is that we don't issue the rules. We don't make the practice. That's a community level authority, right? So it's not like each of us has our own set of rules. That's issued by the community. And it's that practice that we are born into without any choice, really. I mean, it sort of reminds me of the Saussure podcast.
So you didn't like the example I just gave? I just invented a game of we can't say Philosophy Bros real names, and that counts as... I thought you could have it either way.
You can explicitly issue rules, and as long as we all agree to play with that, that's fine. But let's say, so you explicitly issue this...
Wait, I don't understand this whole business of agreeing. It's not like everybody sits down and has a constitution regarding their languages.
No, but when we learn language, we are
Right.
learning to participate according to the more or less standard rules. Good God, more or less standard.
The customs.
We are learning to, participate in a language form.
Yeah, in a practice.
And how, right, so this is why meaning is used. So, like, when you were in middle school and you discovered sarcasm, that was like a miraculous thing. When a kid first discovers sarcasm, it's such a big moment in his life, and then he alienates all of his friends by being constantly sarcastic, and maybe I'm getting too autobiographical here, not important. The point is that, like, learning to do sarcasm is learning a new language game. And no one, like, sits down and says, okay, here are the rules of sarcasm. What happens is a parent says something like, yeah, you can stay up as late as you want. And you're like, awesome. And they're like, no, I was being sarcastic. And then you get better at sarcasm as you lose friends and start to realize you have to temper yourself. And that's how people get better at particular language games. You can sit down and issue explicit rules like, every time you guys say my name, we make a funny sound. But that's not typically how language learning proceeds.
But also, even when you do that, it's still established at the community level. The idea is that we can't each issue our, this sort of gets us at the private language argument. We can't just each individually have our own set of rules and imagine we're interpreting things according to our own idiosyncratic set of rules. The game and meaning occur between at least two people.
I like thinking about this whole, what if two people are using different language games?
Yeah, it's a good thought experiment, yeah.
I was using sarcasm and you didn't realize I was. But what if, it seems like you could have double meanings. So let's say I just come up to you and engage you in conversation and you think we're playing the engaging in light conversation language game. But what I'm really doing is feeling you out to see if you're going to be a good mark for my robbing you later, for my con. So in a sense, it seems like the conning language game is something I'm trying to do with language. I didn't make up what conning is. I didn't make up the fact that there is property and there is robbery, and all this kind of stuff. But I'm still doing something that you're not in on, even though I'm communicating with you and you think I'm making sense.
That's just deception, though. I mean, the con artist still understands what the meaning ostensibly is, right? They know what the mark is going to believe that they're saying. And
ostensibly, normally a great word. Maybe go with supposedly in this context.
Ostentatiously.
Ostentatious.
No, I said ostensibly because it was just too irresistible in the context of, ostensive. So anyway, but yeah.
Right. So that's really good. You were actually making a pun. I thought you were just playing the normal saying things language game, and I was like, whoa, you got to be careful. And
I really was just making the pun for myself. I didn't expect it to.
Actually, I thought you said ostensibly.
You did.
And that was a different word than ostensively.
Right. It's a different word. I was just saying, we're all going to get confused.
Let's look at an example like Andy Kaufman and his humor. Andy Kaufman would go to a club and he'd put a plant in there and he would engage in a comedy routine that then would involve a member of the audience who he knew, but then ended up being a kind of joke on the other audience. So he would play this kind of, it doesn't rise quite to the level of a genuinely private language because it involves himself and some other people, but it involves more than a ruse or a deception, like in a con, because it involves a manipulation. So he is self-consciously using a language game that he expects a reaction from his general audience in such a way. And it's sort of even playing with what their reaction is going to be without them understanding the game he's playing.
So that's fine. What he's doing is he is manipulating the rules that they're playing by. But he needs to know what he needs to understand those rules in order to fuck with them. And it's not private because you can describe what he's doing.
Yeah. I'm not making a strong argument for private language right here. But I guess what I would say is that the part that makes me think that there's a flavor or a rings of relative intimacy of language, maybe not genuinely private, has to do with both that example that I gave with Kaufman, but also the whole notion that we can figure something out, so that we can figure out a language game that we have never played before by either example or watching it, as long as it's close enough, as long as it has some fingers or some resonances with it, but we can figure it out. And so that tells us something about the way we process language games, or the way language works for us, and gets to the root of sort of why this would be true, Wittgenstein's claims would be true, is that the example that we can just figure them out, that we can figure anything out at the end of the day.
Right. If Wittgenstein were wrong about private language or personal rules, you would have to say something about Andy Kaufman like, right, so Andy Kaufman, he's fucking with the audience, and he gets this internal feeling that he calls Bralia, and no one really knew what Bralia was. It was an emotion that only he could have. No one can refer to it. In fact, the only reason I know that he felt that is he said once, I feel the feeling Bralia. But no one has any idea what Bralia is. If that doesn't make sense, what he was really feeling is like amusement and maybe smug self-satisfaction is Bralia. And he doesn't really have that private feeling because we can talk about what he was doing. Even an individual who takes himself to be doing language in a new way or a different way has to be doing it in a way that it can be figured out. And I think that's right.
Yeah, the private language is the meanings can't possibly be known by anyone but the speaker, right? So it's not just that it happens to be private. It's
right.
If you created a private language for your diary and you were speaking about everyday sorts of things, in principle, we can translate that. So it's not really a private language in the strong sense that Wittgenstein means. He means that it's untranslatable. And the reason why Wittgenstein even brings that up is that he seems to be arguing against a Cartesian notion of mental states that are completely inaccessible to others. So Mark has pains and these specific states, I can't possibly know them. Not just that I don't happen to know them, but in principle, I can't possibly know those mental states.
So should we read some text of the private language argument since we're talking about it?
199 is the first place I have a note that is something like where he starts to build towards the private language argument. This is probably before we explicitly mentions it.
Sure. It is relevant here because it's about obeying a rule.
Right.
And maybe I should read a connecting thing that's actually in the section that we are reading to see how tightly this whole thing fits together. I was looking at 31, and he's talking about chess. And this is the third paragraph of 31. I'm explaining chess to someone, and I begin by pointing to a chessman and saying, this is the king. It can move like this, and so on. In this case, we shall say the words, this is the king, or this is called the king, are a definition only if the learner already knows what a piece in a game is. That is, if he has already played other games or has watched other people playing and understood and similar things. Further, only under these conditions will he be able to ask relevantly in the course of learning the game, what do you call this? That is, this piece in a game. We may say, only someone who already knows how to do something with it can significantly ask for a name. So that sort of starts off, and then a whole lot of what comes after that is, well, what is this rule following? I mean, he's already said it's not a matter of explicitly having a formula in your head that you consult, because just in our talking about how we figure out a new language game based on knowing other language games, it can't be something as instructive as that. And one of the things we were saying last time is that if you think that this rule following is a matter of sort of having an explicit rule in your head that you look at, well, then you would need instructions on how to interpret that rule, which would lead to an infinite regress, right? You can't have a rule about how to use a rule, etc. So then looking at ahead to, what did you say?
199.
199. Yeah. Is what we call obeying a rule, something that it would be possible for only one man to do, and to do only once in his life. This is, of course, a note on the grammar of the expression to obey a rule. And he says, so it's not. It's not possible that there should have been only one occasion which someone obeyed a rule. It is not possible there should have been only one occasion on which a report was made or an order given or understood, etc. To obey a rule, to make a report, to give an order, to play a game of chess are customs.
That's sort of a preliminary to the body of the argument, right?
Right. But you can see how it flows very naturally from what was going on earlier.
Yeah.
204. As things are, I can, for example, invent a game that is never played by anyone. But would the following be possible too? Mankind has never played any games. Once, however, someone invented a game which no one ever played.
He's still on about the rules. Yeah, I mean, it's all related, of course.
That was 204. He gives a response to that. But that's just the queer thing about intention. This is in quotes, so it's his opponent. It is just the queer thing about intention, about the mental process, that the existence of a custom, of a technique, is not necessary to it. That, for example, it is imaginable that two people should play chess in a world in which otherwise no games existed, and that even that they should begin a game of chess and then be interrupted. And he answers, but isn't chess defined by its rules, and how are these rules present in the mind of the person who's intending to play chess? And then he goes more and more on, this is related to that, the comments about meaning. Like, well, if you think meaning is something in the head, that's not going to capture it. Just like obeying a rule is not something in the head because it's just not an explicit thing you could express in one sentence that you're reading off of some inner space in yourself. It is a complex and kind of flexible thing that enables you to act in a human way.
I have this great image of someone like who's never ever played games or known they exist, and you sit down with a chessboard and you're like, so here are the pieces, and they're like, the what? And you're like, the things that we move, and then I'm going to move one, and then you move one. And they're like, so in what order do you move them? Oh, I don't know. However, it's going to get to take my king. But why? Why would you want to... I think what he's getting at is you would have to explain before you could invent a game where there were no games before. You'd have to invent, like, playing, and then playing a game, and then you'd have to suddenly build this entire notion just to give chess any sense whatsoever.
243.
That's exactly where I was looking.
Yeah.
Go ahead and read it.
A human being can encourage himself, give himself orders, obey, blame, and punish himself. He can ask himself a question and answer it. We could even imagine human beings who spoke only in monologue, who accompanied their activities by talking to themselves. An explorer who watched them and listened to their talk might succeed in translating their language into ours. This would enable him to predict the people's actions correctly, for he also hears them making resolutions and decisions. But could we also imagine a language in which a person could write down or give vocal expressions to his inner experiences, his feelings, moods, and the rest, for his private use? Well, can't we do so in our ordinary language? But that is not what I mean. The individual words of this language are to refer to what can only be known to the person speaking, to his immediate private sensations, so another person cannot understand the language. And then he goes on with the private language argument.
Well, we might as well read the next one. 244. How do words refer to sensations? There doesn't seem to be any problem here. Don't we talk about sensations every day and give them names? But how is the connection between name and a thing named set up? This question is the same as, how does a human being learn the meaning of the names of sensations, of the word pain, for example? Here's one possibility. Words are connected with the primitive, the natural expressions of the sensation and used in their place. A child has hurt himself and he cries. Then adults talk to him and teach him exclamations and later sentences. They teach the child new pain behavior. All right. So he's already giving his what sounds very behaviorist alternative to the idea that, again, language based on ostension, so then language about inner states would have to be based on ostension, is that I examine pain in myself and I say, there's pain. Then there's a problem there. How do I know that what I mean by pain when I refer to myself is the same as what you mean by pain when you refer to yourself? And don't we all have unique psyches? And couldn't we come up with these words that refer to these strange feelings that only we have, or we just can't know whether anyone has them? Doesn't that make sense? And he just thinks that that's just based on, again, a whole ridiculous conception of what linguistic meaning amounts to. Linguistic meaning is not a matter of having an image in your head when you say a word.
Yeah, so 246, just two later, says, in what sense are my sensations private? Well, only I can know whether I am really in pain. Another person can only surmise it. In one way, this is wrong, and in another, nonsense. If we are using the word to know as it is normally used, and how else are we to use it? Then other people very often know when I am in pain. Yes, but all the same not with the certainty with which I know it myself. It can't be said of me at all, except perhaps as a joke, that I know I am in pain. What is it supposed to mean, except perhaps that I am in pain? Other people cannot be said to learn of my sensations only from my behavior, for I cannot be said to learn of them. I have them. The truth is, it makes sense to say about other people that they doubt whether I am in pain, but not to say it about myself.
I think that's really hard for people to understand because he was sort of going back and forth between interlocutor and response.
Well, okay, so maybe they need to have the text in front of them.
But the basic idea is that he doesn't think it makes sense to say we know our own private sensations.
We have them. And it's a result of a misunderstanding of what it means to know something that we would ascribe a claim like having a private language, because we never own our sensations in a way of knowing them.
This one, I think, doesn't work very well, because I think he's ascribing to the concept of knowing something which really belongs to the concept of assertion in general, of the reason why we don't say, I know I'm in pain to someone, and generally in language, is not because it doesn't make sense from the standpoint of the concept. No, it's just because we don't make that kind of assertion to people unless they have reason to doubt it. So the reason to doubt thing comes up with respect to the concept of assertion, not with respect to the concept of know. I think jumping on its weakness right there, because I think it's part of the private language argument, but it's not all of it. That's one of the sort of threads he's using to argue against private language, but I don't think it's the strongest one.
What are the other prongs of the private language argument besides a kind of epistemological claim?
In order for a word to have meaning, it must be able to be right or wrong. There must be some correct ascription of meaning or incorrect description of meaning according to the language game. But that language game always occurs at the level of community. So you can't get meaning at the individual private level. So even if you're making these individual ascriptions, later on he's going to talk about naming a sensation as S or something like that. that activity isn't doing what on first blush it looks to us like it's doing, because we're already presupposing the language game. But a truly private language couldn't rest on that community language game in general. And so you couldn't really get meaning at that level. I don't think I've done a very good job of describing that, but I think that's the other major prong of the argument.
Formally, the private language argument is thought to start at 256. This is on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So some of the things we read are sort of the precursors to it, which actually I want to read 255 because it's one of his pithy things. It's just the philosopher's treatment of a question is like the treatment of an illness.
What does that mean? I wrote a question mark by that.
It means that questions only arise because, and he has other earlier pithy sayings in the work to support this, because we've taken some word out of its customary context and we don't know what to do with it. So in this case, what we understand in situations where we call something knowledge is, I'm looking for my shoe and, oh, there's my shoe. Now I know where my shoe is. But looking at our own inner states is not, we might want to attach the word knowledge to that, but it's really not appropriate.
So the philosophical problems arise from misuse of language, right?
Yep.
The true approach here is to relieve ourselves of those problems, not by developing the right theory, but by therapeutically getting rid of our misuse of language.
Right. One really, I think, good way to say this, and this was a comment that someone made on Reddit in response to something I said once that just kind of blew me away. Someone said that what we normally think of as philosophy is an emergent property of discussion, not a thing to do separately as its own thing. And in these discussions, problems arise. Philosophy allows us to figure out what the answer to that problem is. Therapeutically is a good word, right? So we treat a question we examine it, we lay it out, but it's not something that we have to make. I guess the important thing there is philosophy is an emergent property of discussions. So on Wittgenstein's view of what philosophy should be doing, we can never really get rid of philosophy in the sense of answer all the philosophical questions that there are. We can only treat the questions that will arise emerging from discussions.
And the reason why questions arise is it's just a characteristic of language or a characteristic of us, or?
Yeah, it's just a characteristic of discussions.
I think it's a clash between different language games. Taking something out of one context and putting it into another. I was just thinking about sarcasm in this context, that sarcasm sort of relies on everybody normally telling the truth. Sarcasm is a parasitic phenomena. So sort of imagine a society of, a junior high with no teachers where everyone is sarcastic. Then what does that even mean? How would you understand anyone? Or is it just opposite day? Or is there's something that would be taking the concept of sarcasm out of its usual environment, which is a rebellion against the straight-laced or something like that. And so it could become like a Zen koan, the one hand clapping, or does the tree fall in a forest? What is a sarcastic person in a room of all sarcastic people or something? And he would want to say, no, that's obviously a bullshit philosophical question. Just understand what sarcasm is and it'll go away. So that's an easy one.
Right.
But virtue or something,
So questions about what really is a sentient being? Can artificial intelligence ever become sentient? That's a philosophical question that emerges out of discussions about what sentience is and what artificial intelligence, what direction it's going in. And we can treat that question by, so what do we normally mean by sentience? This is really important. It will never be the case that good, science has answered all the questions. There's nothing for philosophy to do. Science has told us that AI is sentient. How did it do that? It's parasitic on a particular use of sentient. But we can't ever get rid of philosophical questions. We can only treat them as they arise, lay them out.
But the reason, for that particular case, this seems to me the reason why that question arises is because you would make a claim that there's a similarity between a computer or some kind of program, that you see a likeness with a human being. Or even before you have computers, just a mechanical system that operates without you touching it, that seems to have its own activity. And then you make the leap, well, it seems to be alive because it has its own activity. And the root of all that is making the leap that one thing is like another. And this goes to what Mark was saying, that you are applying one language game to another language game. So there's this kind of likeness, this pattern matching, or whatever you want to call it, that we have, that we do, that tries to overlap one thing into another. And maybe in sort of the frisson of that, you get both something like philosophy or that activity in trying to sort that out. But it's born out of this activity of finding things to be like one another and trying to see if they really are or not. And part of that ends in trying to become atomistic about it. And part of it comes in giving up the notion of being atomistic about it because you can't reduce it.
Right. So one way to clarify that sort of confusion of possible likeness, I think probably the right way to Wittgenstein here is to examine what do we mean when we say this thing. Let's try and make that clearer so that we understand how this word is typically being used. The wrong way to go about it, and what earlier Wittgenstein tried to do, is by stipulation. The wrong way to go about figuring out if robots are humans, if they're sentient, is to stipulate robots are not sentient. Boom. That's not what philosophy should do, and when it does that, that's when problems arise.
And here's another criticism of this sort, just to give another example. From our Philosophy of Mind episode, we read some Gilbert Ryle, and he talked of the Cartesian dualism as a category mistake, where basically Descartes' theory that there's a substance, soul, is a product of thinking, of reifying something that's really an abstract term that doesn't have a fixed object that it's referring to. So other terms of the sort, like university as more of an abstraction, and it's, you're not going to say, okay, here's this ball of substance in my hand. University must stand for something like this. Same thing for soul. And the idea is that that kind of mistake is a product of the way language works, of grammar. We expect any noun to sort of have this nice, solid, tangible referent to it. And so we slip up on that. And so that's where some philosophical problems come from. Ultimately, I don't find that very convincing. I argued in that episode that, in fact, it's not a category mistake, and that even if you reject Cartesian dualism, it's actually a legitimate attempt to come up with a theory to solve a legitimate problem, but that's another matter. And I think here, this idea that philosophical problems arise out of problems of misuse of language, let's say, or bad habits instilled in us by language, or trying to take it out of context, I don't find that convincing. I think philosophical problems have their own legitimacy even after you've done all this language stuff.
I generally think of Wittgenstein as providing the groundwork for folks like Ryle, like you were just discussing, but it sounded like, bro, you were just saying that the upshot of Wittgenstein here is that we need... Were you contradicting that, or were you just saying, oh, there is a role for philosophy, but the role of philosophy is dissolving these problems? But it sounded like you were saying by philosophy should not stipulate, you were saying something different than that, that you were saying something more like what Wes is arguing for, which is that these perennial philosophical problems will stay alive regardless of the outcome of science.
I was also saying that philosophical problems will exist regardless of the progress of science. I do also agree that the role of philosophy is to dissolve these problems. Some people have taken a really hardline stance out of Wittgenstein that, like, philosophy is bullshit. I'm not saying there's not a lot of bullshit done in philosophy, but I'm not saying something like there is no role for philosophy. What I mean by philosophy shouldn't stipulate is Wittgenstein seems to be saying the wrong way to go about dissolving these problems is to just declare an answer. So let's say something like you declare sentience is anything that is like humans but isn't a robot. Well, then someone might say, well, what if a virus got out, like a nanoparticle virus got out, and that eventually evolved techno-organically into a robot, but it's made of the things that this robot we built is made of. So then you have to go back and stipulate something like, okay, nothing built is sentient, but evolution, that's fine. And so you have to make these stipulations. When you freeze one variable, all of a sudden everything else goes haywire. So you have to start freezing new things, and that's how you get philosophical problems of the sort that Wittgenstein is dismissing.
So the idea is that you look at use in order to figure these things out and not simply stipulate. Right. How are these words actually used? And so for some background, Gilbert Ryle was considered one of these ordinary language philosophers who variously were thought to sort of be working in the tradition of later Wittgenstein, but then they denied that they were doing exactly the same thing, or they denied his influence. And I think Wittgenstein didn't want to be associated with him either. I think he is still living when some of that stuff was going on. But the ordinary language philosophers as well, like Ryle, were focused on looking at how words were being used. G. Moore was, another notorious one for that, right?
I hear two things going on in this discussion about whether you can be doing philosophy. One would be that Well, at the end, all philosophy is a kind of therapy. It's therapeutic. What do we mean when we say that term, that it's therapeutic?
We had this in the Buddhism episode as well.
Yes.
The idea there was that Buddhist ethics was more therapeutic than Aristotelian ethics. And the idea was that, so for instance, in Aristotelian ethics, you had to have the right sort of upbringing, and then developing these virtues was a matter of, I think to some extent, habituation and learning, let's say. And the therapeutic idea is that you actually have to get rid of certain bad proclivities. So in Buddhist ethics, you have lust and these other poisons in your desire that you have to work to get rid of. And they're universal to all human beings. So no matter how good your upbringing is, you have these things that need to be therapeutically gotten rid of. And I think that's the idea here with Wittgenstein, that once we start reflecting on things, once we start using language to talk about language, let's say, which is inevitably what we're doing when we're reflecting, we naturally develop these sorts of confusions that can therapeutically be removed when we learn not to play the wrong sort of game, when we learn not to involve ourselves in these confusions. And I think, again, looking at the way language is used is one way to get out of that. So one of the confusions, for instance, is the way he starts the whole work, which is the idea that ostension is a model for language in general, or the idea that these descriptive atomic sentences are a model for the way language works in general. That sort of approach, instead of looking at the way language is actually used, it's motivated by the attempt to theorize, right? By the attempt to create a model where we can make these very firm links between, let's say, atomic sentences and facts in the world, and then build up the rest of the world out of that. That attempt to theorize and build a nice model to explain everything, I think, goes out the window here. Those theories are become misguided, and our propensity even to engage in that theorizing, that kind of theorizing behavior, I think he seems to think needs to be therapeutically removed.
But this goes exactly to the other prong, which seems to me that you were speaking of, which was criticizing Ryle for dismissing the Cartesian argument, saying that even if there are problems with the Cartesian argument, things like that are still philosophically live and breathing. They're not laid to rest because they are useful.
No, actually, what I was saying was, so Ryle was arguing that, so I think most of us agree that Cartesian substance dualism doesn't work as a theory. But Ryle was saying, well, it's not just that it's a bad theory, it's not meaningful. It's not even a meaningful theory. It's a category mistake. And so I'm arguing that no, it's a meaningful theory that meaningfully attempts to solve a problem. It happens to be a bad theory. But Ryle is saying something much stronger, and that's what I reject, the idea that it's simply meaningless.
I still think you could be, without taking the hard line of Ryle, his conclusion, taking Wittgenstein's approach here is useful for that problem. So you say, why do we think we have minds? Well, because we talk to each other and we use these terms like belief or desire, and we can sort of think about in what context we actually use them. But it would be...
But that's just you already have to believe that the theory is wrong. That's just a post hoc rationalization of why it's wrong. You're giving a genetic account of how did we come into this confusion. You're not really giving an argument of...
No, I'm not saying in advance that is a confusion. I'm saying if you're going to make a claim that the soul is not a substance, the soul is not an object, then you have to come up with some... All right, well, maybe I am...
Yeah, because it could be the case that we have all kinds of motivations, and even illegitimate motivations, pushing us in the direction of saying the soul is an object. But that doesn't say anything about whether the soul is actually an object. That's the genetic fallacy, right? So whatever our motivations are, that's fine. It's great to give an account of human motivations. Once you believe it's false, once you believe we've made this mistake, then yeah, we need to figure out, well, what motivated us? How did we fall into that trap? But unless we know already that it's a mistake, simply describing those motivations won't tell us that it's a mistake.
Well, I think that your point about the genetic fallacy gets exactly to the point of your problems with pragmatism before and the problems you're expressing with Wittgenstein here, that all these folks say, for instance, going back to the thing we hashed to death in the pragmatism episodes about truth. And you said folks like Russell and even later pragmatists like Rorty want to distinguish between what truth actually is and how we figure out that something is true. Mm-hmm. Which is exactly what a pragmatist like William James is going to deny. And I think Wittgenstein would also be denying that I thought in my Tractatus days, the truth, following Russell, following Frege, the truth was this primary indefinable thing, that it's like a binary, every atomic sentence either is true or is not true. But if you're going to take Wittgenstein's approach in this book, then you would have to say, in what context do we use the word truth? How do we learn about to act appropriately in these contexts? And it might just be the case that there are plenty of things that just aren't true or aren't false. Like it's an inappropriate concept to apply. And I think maybe some of these, is the mind the same as the body or something? Wittgenstein's going to say those two concepts come from different language games. And so there really isn't a yes or no answer. Just the concept of truth does not apply to that at all. Is that just nonsense?
The concept of truth doesn't apply to what?
To the claim the mind is the body, or the mind is a separate substance from the body. Both of these involve some sort of grammatical mistake.
Those are meaningless for Wittgenstein. So yeah, you can't
ascribe early Wittgenstein. Those are meaningless.
Well, I think for both. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah.
I don't think he wants to say that it's meaningless to say that the thing we are referring to with the mind. I don't know if he wants to say those are meaningless. He probably wants to say something like that philosophical problem isn't interesting or productive. Trying to decide, is the mind the same as the body? What are you going to do about that?
Well, it involves a mistake of language games. Right. It involves a confusion of language games. And when you try to describe what the two language games are, you're doing exactly what I was trying to do that Wes was objecting to. You're giving a genetic account of how we found out about, what is our interaction with body? Well, a body gets sick. If I punch you in the body, then, there's all these things that we can say about how we know about bodies. And there are different things that we would say about how we know about minds or pains or something. And so you could say that whatever the relationship is between these, at least this distinction of language is informative, that we don't have to be forced into this, fallacy of misplaced concreteness of putting them all in the same ontological category. It doesn't mean you have to take Ryle's hard line and say it's actually meaningless to even ask the question, but there's something a little screwed up in asking the question because these concepts don't come from quite the same place. So maybe the solution then is to elaborate a very complex story, about emergence or something like this, about how these things relate.
Right.
And by the way, we do need to return to private language after we're done with all this, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But this is interesting. This is very on point.
Part of this is that the claim about the relative truth value and that, we're doing lots of language games and stuff like that, is in one way very second order because you still have to use those games, right? So on the one hand, you can be conscious of the fact that you are participating in these games. And in fact, I suspect what Wittgenstein would say that you are in fact conscious of this all the time because you apply different kinds of language games in different sorts of situations and ways of life all the time. But you still have to also participate in a game.
No, Wittgenstein explicitly rejects second-order philosophy.
Well, okay, so this is where I want to understand it a little bit better because it seems to me that in the way that you can talk about how all your practices are therapeutic, yada, 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 the fact is you're going to have some practices, and you will have some practices even if they are somehow de facto or unchosen, and they will involve following some rules in a game. And you can be then conscious of that fact and maybe refine your games and maybe self-consciously participate in a kind of therapy for them. But you're still going to be participating in a game. And so the discussion gets to be very second order about what you're doing rather than just doing something, right? While all the while recognizing that there might be limits to what you're doing, but not harping on the fact that there are always limits to what you're doing.
So you're saying that what Wittgenstein is doing is second order in that he's talking about how language games work, and then he says, and we use language games this way, but he doesn't ever do that. Right? So he's saying philosophy should be therapeutic, let's not get wrapped up in arbitrary metaphysical questions, but he never shows you what we should be doing instead. Is that what you're...
Well, I'm not saying that he would even want to say what we're supposed to be doing instead, right? Recognizing that there are limits and that there's games involved and so forth would go a long way, say, in a political realm to subverting dogmatism and that sort of thing. It seems to me that there would be an activity of more productively than others engaging in thinking about something. And one of the reasons I was thinking about this had to do with what Wes was saying earlier about Descartes and the usefulness of Descartes' mind-body dualism and stuff like that. I was not focusing on what his criticism of Ryle was. And to me, it was interesting that it was worth understanding and thinking through Descartes' claims, and not because they were simply wrong, but because it is a structure. I don't know if it rises exactly to a language game, but a structured claim about the world. And that is a different kind of thing than what Wittgenstein is doing. Wittgenstein is saying something about the way we make claims about the world. And that's what I mean by it being second order.
He's making claims about the way we make claims about the world.
Right, but I could see where you could be critical of how he's not being positive enough because, for instance, that exchange that I just had with Wes about Ryle, I don't think Wittgenstein gives very good guidance on how do you tell a good account of what language games are going on from a bad one. Wes was saying that if I'm trying to give this genetic account of, well, we come up with mind from certain interactions with each other, and we come up with body from different interactions with each other. And Wes was saying, no, that's just all because you've already decided the issue in your head and you're making up these accounts after the fact. And I don't think Wittgenstein has a good way of telling us when we're just bullshitting about what is a language game and what is not in situations like that.
It seems to me that that's the kind of thing that Wittgenstein is going to fail to do. And in some ways, this is the kind of problem that you have in pragmatism, which I'm also very sympathetic with, which is that you talk about the activity itself as activities without giving necessarily a lot of guidance about how you judge between individual activities, because you're going to maintain along the way that certain ways of doing things are better than others. You don't want to be fundamentally relativist in this respect. Maybe Wittgenstein will end up being extraordinarily relativist. I guess it doesn't seem to me that he is. That he seems to me to be pointing out a multiplicity and aspectualness to language that is intrinsic and fundamental, but trying to sidestep, at least, if not deny, utter relativity, which would sort of lead to a kind of meaninglessness.
It seems like he would just say that the best language games, or the best way to play language games, are just the ways that are most successful. So in that sense, I don't know if it's relative so much as relativized, right? Like whichever language game is best going to accomplish conveying your meaning or conveying meaning. I don't want to privilege your meaning there.
Well, the problem of...
Which sounds circular the way you just put it.
I don't want to... Yeah.
The problem of relativism arises because the criterion of correctness is community use. And we can't really ask whether the whole community could be wrong about anything.
Right.
Right and wrong doesn't make sense at that level. Right and wrong only makes sense in comparing the individual to community use. So that's another long argument. What
immediately comes to mind there is ethics, and a couple episodes from now, we will have an episode specifically on Alistair McIntyre on virtue ethics, who is following up on Wittgenstein in this way. We can save the particular analysis of that very obvious but huge topic for then.
So it's relative, but in this really, really super loose way that, like, it doesn't matter what words you pick to refer to things as long as everyone agrees to that word, right? So the color that we know is red, it's relative in that other languages' words for red are perfectly good words. But it's not relative in the sense that, like, is red closer to orange than it is to blue, and corresponding words.
Our semantic theory, though, right, has to give us grounds for true and false. And so if meaning is use,
right,
then we're not going to get a true and false. We're not going to get a correspondence theory, any kind of theory that is grounded in, say, comparison of language to the world. And so naturally, those relativistic problems arise.
Yep.
Which is not to say, it's necessarily relativist, but there's an argument to be had there.
I see what you're saying. I don't know how far I want to pursue this, just offhand.
Yeah, let's punt that to a Rorty episode or something.
No, that's,
in the future.
And that gets boring very quickly.
Boy, does it.
One of the really positive things that I get out of this around 65 to 67 here is this notion of family resemblances, which we haven't brought up explicitly, but
that's super important.
It's exactly where we've been going with a lot of this. He uses the idea of a game partly to say, he says in 66, consider all the things that we call games, board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say there must be something common or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there's anything common to them all. For if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. And then by 67, he says, I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eye, gait, temperament, etc. And I shall say games form a family. And so this is actually going to be his overall toppling of what a definition is, going back to Aristotle and going back to Plato, where Plato says, you haven't said what justice is. You've just given me some examples of justice. And you should be able to look at what all those have in common, and that's what justice is. And Wittgenstein is just flatly denying that. That's just not how language works. There might be a lot of things we call games or justice or virtue or truth, and they're just not going to be comparable. You can't just find something that's common among them or pick, this is the right one or something. It's more a case. Normally when I would introduce this in a class or something, talk about, you've got a paradigm case and then you have borderline cases. So if you ask what is a bird in essence, there really is no answer to that, but there is psychologically things that we typically think of when we call birds, and then things that are like penguins or emus. There are, things that we might not be sure whether it's a bird or not that are the borderline cases. Reading this time, I discovered actually he wouldn't use that term borderline because he has a quote in here somewhere that says, what is a fuzzy border? Like there's no such thing as a fuzzy border. Either there's a border there or there's not a border. So if really concepts kind of melt into each other because we're getting out of the normal uses of the words, then you can't say there are borderline cases. You just say there are cases that are part of a different language game or are not specified in the standard language game.
Yeah, but it seems to me that he's wrong about that, right? There are all kinds of fuzzy borders. I don't really get that. Why would he deny that there are fuzzy borders?
It seems like what he's saying is that
there's ultra fuzzy borders.
Right. You can't say like, oh, there's a border there, but it's kind of fuzzy. Let's clarify.
The borders are so fuzzy, they break down altogether.
Right. So the thing about borderline cases isn't that they fall one way or the other on the border and we just can't decide where. The thing about borderline cases is who the fuck knows? That's what makes I don't know, good question, is the right answer to a borderline case.
But what's interesting about that is, let's say I have a border stripe. So what you're saying is that there are cases that are clearly away from the border on either side.
Right.
Rather than being a line, there's this sort of no man's land.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, there is a kind of gradation along that no man's land from one side to the other. And then this in-between time, it's who the fuck knows.
Right.
But in addition, there are cases where it's utterly clear, one side or the other.
Yeah.
It's not clear that he's saying that all concepts work this way in the same way that the concept of game does, right? Not all concepts work by the overlapping family resemblances principle, or am I wrong about that?
Would it be maybe the natural concepts that sort of arise organically,
Yeah,
that
maybe
those
that's
are all
a good-
fuzzy? Whereas, you could invent a game where we just define something very specifically, and then if that catches on...
But also like mathematical concepts, or there are lots of examples that you get nice, strict delimitations of your concepts, right?
So here's a really good example of what he's talking about. I think you're right that the natural concepts is a good sort of way to gesture at the concepts that have this property, but any attempt to figure out, okay, so find which words work this way and which ones don't. You're going to end up not being able to draw a line between the kind of concepts that are fuzzy and the kind that are clear, except there. I think that one really helpful way to think about what Wittgenstein is saying is anywhere he makes an assertion, it's implicitly followed by except when it's not. Which concepts are like this? The natural ones. Oh, except when it's not a natural one. Dylan, I think you're right that there are not always, there are often clear cases and not clear cases, and then the border, no man's land, is a good way to think about it. Here's an example that I never get tired of because I spent some time in the South. Baseball, clearly a sport. Bananas, clearly not a sport. NASCAR, how do we feel about NASCAR? Sport? Not a sport? Who knows? In the South, they're going to insist, absolutely, it's a sport. Anywhere else, they're going to say they're just kind of driving cars real fast. Like, that's not a sport any more than chess is a sport. And some people are going to say no, but according to this criterion, chess is a sport. And that's just not how we use those words. There's not a right or wrong answer as to whether NASCAR is a sport. Yeah, spoiler alert, there is. It's not a sport. That's the right answer. But that's just me and the way that I typically tend to play the language game. But there's not like an absolute right or wrong way to answer that. Some people use that word in a very slightly different way than I do, and that's just all there is to it.
But going to the community use case, if I then say, as long as I agree on my language game, I'm going to constrain the cases that are fuzzy to be many fewer. So in the case with your example with NASCAR, it seems pretty much that it comes down to an argument about what you mean by sport and what language game you're engaging in when you use that word and speak of that universe of things and what the criteria are for calling something a sport. And then it becomes a discussion about that. It becomes a kind of semantic argument. It's the same thing with marriage, right? The whole marriage argument going on has to do with what you want to have that word mean. But you can also agree on the rules for what you mean by that word. And then it becomes much easier to speak about whether it falls in this category or that category because you've established the rules for it.
Well, you've established rules for it in a particular language game, say the legal language game.
Yeah.
Right. So one really weird thing that Rick Santorum does is he gives this stupid fucking speech where he says that gay marriage can't be a thing because marriage just is, by definition, between a man and a woman. There's no such thing as gay marriage. And we would say, like, really? Because there's a law that says gay people can get married, and that's how that law uses that word. So the problem there is that Rick Santorum is trying to take a word out of context and freeze it when we can just agree to use it in this particular way. But that doesn't become the meaning of marriage, is this legal contract. That just means in this particular language game, the legal language game, that word takes on this meaning. But that doesn't define once and for all, like, all the ways people in America can use the word marriage. So he might say something like, well, but marriage in God's eyes exists between a man and a woman. And your response there wouldn't be, yes, it does. The law defines it that way. Your response would be, that's not the language game we're playing, asshole. We're talking about legally. And those are different things.
Besides which, God's eye is infinitely large, so a gay couple could fit in there, no problem.
Yeah, right?
By the way, looking at 66, where he tries to debunk the notion that there's any common property to games, I'm still sympathetic to the idea that games all have rules.
What about Calvin Ball?
Say it again?
Calvin Ball?
Calvin Ball and Calvin and Hobbes. I think
Go ahead and describe it.
Calvin Ball is a game where you just make up the rules as you go. Someone can just declare a rule.
There's still rules. You're just making them up as you go.
But you can undo those rules whenever you want.
But then that's just another meta rule.
Well, but I think this is a good example because it illustrates what happens when you end up making up the rules literally as you go along. Because what happens is that it always ends, in this case, it ends in violence. Or in an utter end of the game because no one knows what to do. When I would go to the bus stop where I used to live and wait with the kids till the bus came, they're all like 8 years old, and they would be throwing the football around or playing a game 500 or something. And the way these kids would work is that the ones who had, essentially bullying kind of tendencies, they would all change the rules as they went along to their own advantage all the time.
Yep.
And the frustration was palpable because they were not playing by the rules. And then after a while, they would assert a certain set of rules, and then they would tweak them again to their own advantage. Literally playing Calvin Ball, changing the rules all the time as you go along. And what ends up happening is that it becomes about a unspoken set of rules, which has to do with a kind of, the rules of the bully and the rules of power and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's no longer Calvin Ball, at least as I'm interpreting Calvin Ball, because I'm getting the sense that Calvin Ball, you're making up the rules as you go along, but it's a form of play, right? The agreement is that you're making up the rules as you go along, and there's still this meta rule about what you're doing and how that constitutes play. Or take a simpler case with, say, something that doesn't look like we would call it a game, like two kittens playing, for instance, because we know animals play, and we know that's very important to development. What are the rules there? Well, the idea is that, for instance, one kitten is biting another, but they're not biting to do harm. There's a certain amount of restraint involved. There's a certain amount of aggression, but there's a certain amount of restraint. And so there are these implicit circumscribing boundaries to what goes on, even to something that looks fairly amorphous.